Chapter 101. Looking at the current situation alone, it is difficult to think that Renly's plan is correct, because since he started to have contact with the other party, the little nun's stealing habit has not only not been improved, but has become more serious. The only difference is that the things she steals are shared with Renly every time. Rhea has considered herself a friend and knows how to share, which is a good thing. But what he shared was her stolen goods, which made him feel quite subtle. However, Renly did not verbally blame, because the other party could not understand what he meant. Even if he scolded her, she would not know anything, let alone if he was beaten. Growing up, this woman probably received more beatings than ordinary people. There are dozens of times more children. However, despite this, she had to express her opinions, so every time she stole something during this period, Renly would take the little guy and run to the original owner to return the item and apologize. Sometimes he couldn't find it. If it belongs to the original owner, he will give it to an old nun who has high prestige among the nuns, and then ask her to help deal with it. He thought that in this way, Rhea would understand the meaning of doing this sooner or later. At the same time, he didn't think that coming forward like this would cause any trouble. Because of Lia's long-standing reputation, even if she didn't do this, others would be suspicious or even accustomed to it. In other words, if she hadn't been cared for inexplicably in the church, she would have been there long ago. He was kicked out. Now that he has not been kicked out, adding more notoriety is irrelevant. This behavior rather surprised the nuns. Sir Lemon is a good man. What's the use of being a good person? Rhea is hopeless. It's a good thing since Lia can listen to him, and we can avoid a lot of trouble. I hope the gods will bless him. The people who live here are some nuns who are not young. Most of them are very tired of the mute nun who can't be driven away and has poor education. Now there is someone to control it and it is really effective. They are naturally happy to see it. It's just that there are good comments here, but there are also bad ones. The clergy were abstinent and sensitive about it, but now it was hard for a warrior's son to hang out with a nun without attracting criticism. This kind of discussion has never stopped and is even spreading more and more widely. So one day when Renly was in the middle of training, he was called by Knight Moray to talk to him, or to explain his actions. The conversation took place in a conference room. In addition to Knight Moray, there were also Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the Sons of Warriors, the training officer Owen Knight, several deputy captains whom Renly did not recognize, and a monk dressed as a monk. Bald man. We were told that you have recently become close to a nun in the church. The black-haired Captain Nancy has an unusual round face and two thick eyebrows. When the face is straightened up, it looks extremely fierce. However, thinking about the scene when he first saw him, Renly was very worried. It's hard to think of him as a serious person. Sister Rhea, he confessed, I'm teaching her how to read. Literacy. These words seemed to shock the people present. They looked at each other in disbelief. With all due respect, sir, I do not believe that a girl who has been deaf and mute since childhood can learn to write, the bald monk began. He appears to be a member of the Templar, not a member of the Warrior Sons. Have you tried it? Renly asked. Of course not. How do you know it can't work if you haven't tried it? A normal person can understand why she can't, sir. I don't think I need to explain it. The monk shook his head. That's what I originally thought, but it turns out that this perception is wrong. Renly replied seriously, she can understand words. I don't know why, but she can understand. Then why did you teach her to read, or why did you contact a nun? A strange deputy leader asked coldly, seemingly unhappy that such a trouble had occurred in the Knights. For a strong knight to come into contact with a weak nun, this will bring about very bad comments in the church, and the impact will not be very positive. It's just mortal prejudice. Renly had already thought about how to deal with it before he came, so he immediately replied after hearing this, an ancient sage said it well, when you see white arms, you think of nakedness, and when you see nakedness, you think of going to bed. This saying doesn't quite fit here, but the meaning is it's almost the same. When they see us coming together, they think there's adultery. In fact, it's not that complicated at all. It's just that their dirty minds are instinctively thinking about dirty things. Yes, it's instinctive. With all due respect, sirs, such people are probably not very religious. These words made the bald monk cough dryly. Several other people looked at each other in confusion and acted unnaturally. Only Knight Moray remained expressionless. So what's the truth? He asked. The truth is salvation. Renly replied, a person who has been unable to listen or speak since she was a child, and who does not understand any reason except the instinct of eating and drinking, is like a beast, but she is a human being. If a person has fallen to the level of a beast, doesn't he need redemption? Our nuns will naturally teach him, the monk replied. Your nuns can do nothing but slap her ears. There are many people who suffer in the world, but she is nothing in comparison. Of course, but she is a nun living in the temple. Renly said loudly, we preach that the gods save the world, but in the end, there is still one person in the temple who has not been saved under the eyes of the gods in heaven. Isn't this a mistake? Don't we need to make up for it? This made the people in the conference room look at each other, and no one spoke. Renly felt that he had said everything he should say, so he said the last sentence. This is my purpose. Although it will be questioned, I will continue to do so. If you think my starting point is suspicious, then I am ready to accept supervision at any time. After he finished speaking, he shut up and the place fell into a silent atmosphere. However, after a while, Knight Murray raised his hand to signal him, so Renly bowed and left, leaving these people to discuss inside. There was a door behind him, and the sound seemed quite weak. Because someone was guarding the door, Renly had no chance to stay and eavesdrop, so he could only step away, and he felt helpless about it. All these words were just his sophistry. He didn't think his real purpose was noble, and even suspected that he was taking advantage of the feelings of a little girl. But no matter what, he thought this behavior was good, so although he felt awkward sometimes, he still decided to continue. It's just that I had been thinking about the task itself before, but I didn't expect that there would be trouble in such a trivial matter. But after thinking about it, Renly didn't care much, but turned and walked out of the hill, preparing to get the mint he needed today first. Chapter 102. We accept your explanation. No one will bother you for this matter again. On the night of the interview, Knight Murray came to inform him of this matter. In the hut, Renly signaled his servant Egg to pour a cup of mint tea for the guest, and asked at the same time, will someone supervise? The other party smiled faintly. Who will admit that their thoughts are dirty? Renly nodded, but Knight Murray restrained his smile and said, your behavior is good, but you must be careful to avoid suspicion. This is not something that you can avoid trouble just because you are right. At the same time, your words are still too radical. Some people are very dissatisfied with you. Telling the truth always hurts people. Renly shrugged and asked. What are the consequences of this dissatisfaction? You may be sent to patrol the city, and the training will be temporarily terminated. Knight Murray said, I think you still need to continue training. After all, we are not short of manpower at present, but it is also good to start carrying out tasks. This is another kind of experience. As he said, he patted the blonde knight's shoulder, as if to comfort him. Renly, on the other hand, didn't feel anything was wrong. This was normal. He was equipped with horses and assigned armor. The church couldn't have kept him like a noble lord and kept him there for nothing. Even if this didn't happen, he would have stopped training soon. It was just that it might have been a little early now. After giving a few instructions, Knight Murray stepped away. Renly saw him off and fell into deep thought. The gender gap in this world was not that serious. In fact, although this place was very similar to the Middle Ages in memory, the attitude towards women was much more relaxed. There was no saying that women were born filthy and sinful. Apart from anything else, the gods worshipped by the seven gods church had 7 faces in one body, including 3 male images and 3 female images, and one who was neither male nor female. It couldn't be more balanced. So the result of this matter was actually within his expectations. But the impact it brought was quite troublesome for Renly. Training all day was actually very boring, but compared to patrolling without any results, Renly was obviously more enthusiastic about training. After all, he is not a native of this place, so he does not need to brush up his qualifications. It's just that if you want to solve this problem, there is a way. Thinking about it, Renly looked at his armor hanging on the wall unconsciously. The final result of this matter was also inconclusive, because Renly contributed the armor accessory of the lance stand. This thing is very effective. After the experiment, the difference in power between the charge with the lance stand and the gun ring and the ordinary charge is very obvious. As soon as he demonstrated it, he quickly attracted the attention of Knight Murray, who was listening to him, and then quickly received the attention of the senior leaders of the knights. There are countless knights in Westeros, and the sons of warriors are just some of the more special ones. The reason for their specialness is their identity rather than their ability. In fact, despite their reputation, there are not many top knights among the sons of warriors. After all, the life of such church knights is generally hard and restricted. Apart from some impoverished civilian knights, most knights come from noble families and would not consider joining in to suffer under normal circumstances. However, if there is such a special accessory, the ability of the knights of the sons of warriors will be instantly improved to a higher level. Although this improvement is limited to lance charge, the influence it brings is definitely more than that. The name lemon has been mentioned continuously during this period, but compared with the previous things, this mention is much more positive. The benefits brought by this are actually quite a lot. At least he is no longer an unknown person now, and he finally has one more bargaining chip to join the future Seven Sons trial. Of course, if only considering this point, Renly will not hand it over so happily. He has no choice but to decide so. First of all, his armor is obviously different from others. Although the accessory is not very eye-catching, as long as he wears it out, it can still be discovered by someone with a heart. Once it comes, it will inevitably be exposed. Secondly, although the blacksmith made a solemn promise, Renly would not trust a stranger so easily, or even if the other party kept it secret. What about others? There is more than one blacksmith in a blacksmith shop. Finally, Renly did not need to keep it secret. His mission is to join the trial team and also to ensure the final victory of the trial, which is obviously impossible to achieve by his own great power. Reality is not so magical, and there is no panacea to upgrade his combat power immediately. Facing a group of highly skilled tin cans, he really can't raise the slightest sense of superiority. In the end, it still depends on the power of the group. History has changed, but the original historical records can also be used as a reference in the original history. The final victory was the Targaryen side, not the church. So he has no reason to keep the lance rack secret. The only thing worth worrying about is whether this kind of thing will be spread out and used by the enemy, but Renly doesn't think that the church will allow this to happen at this juncture. The natives can't know the possible trials in the future, but they must keep it strictly confidential. After all, this is a big killer. It would be a shame to the gods if they don't make some results before it is exposed. Of course, if there is a traitor who leaks it, that's another story, but considering this is like considering whether you will have diarrhea on the day of the trial. It can't be said to be worrying about nothing, but it is indeed cowardly. The days have returned to their usual rhythm, but for some reason, the explanation he gave to the senior officials that day has gradually spread. Some people admire it, and some seem to agree with it, but in fact they secretly disagree. But all this can't affect Renly. After training for several days, he has mastered the lance since arriving in King's Landing. The level of swordsmanship has not increased, but the use of shields has also reached level 4. Although this level is far from that of senior knights, it is not much worse than that of young new knights. Although he is not qualified for the trial, Renly is already very satisfied with it. It's just a pity that he looks not much different from a knight, and what he has learned is basically the same. Why didn't he awaken the knight profession? After all, in his understanding, the bard profession is just a mixture of some musical instruments and singing skills, and there is nothing strange except for the derived characteristics. It stands to reason that the knight should be like this. Is there any connection that I haven't thought of? Renly thought. Or is it that the profession cannot be acquired by active learning? In addition, he has completed the task of guiding the Son of Chaos and has achieved initial results. For example, although Rya's habit of stealing has not improved, when Renly dragged her to apologize, she would also follow Renly's example and bow, which surprised a group of nuns, and then changed their impression of her. They also looked at Renly, the son of a warrior who volunteered, with a new look. Of course, Renly felt that Rhea didn't know what she was doing when she did this, and it was probably just a simple imitation. Anyway, she looked quite confused. But again, this is a good start. Renly believes that if she keeps going like this, she will understand what is good and evil sooner or later. Unfortunately, things rarely seem to go smoothly. Time passed quickly in the dull yet fulfilling busyness. 10 days passed in a flash since Renly took back the armor. On the afternoon of the 10th day, he went to the Fisherman's Square in King's Landing to keep the appointment with caution. Originally, Renly was still wary of the possibility of a trap in this appointment, but he met the King's Guard of his family smoothly. Unfortunately, the other party did not bring the dragon egg, but brought bad news instead. Dragonstone is now controlled by Queen Vicennes, and I can't get close to His Majesty. The middle-aged man with a beard, still wearing a black cloak, said seriously, and His Majesty's condition has worsened, and he is almost dying. This made Renly stunned. Although he had some guesses about the possibility of the king's illness, he had not obtained any accurate information about it before, but now he directly heard that King Aeneas's condition had worsened. Not only was it so abrupt, but the time was also much earlier than he remembered. This alone did not affect anything, but the consequences of this incident were very obvious. After King Aeneas's death, a new king will definitely take the throne, and this successor is Maegor Targaryen in the original history. Maegor will come directly to King's Landing after taking the throne, and then the trial will take place. This is the original historical trend, and if things continue to proceed in this direction, it means that Renly will not have much time left. Chapter 103. Kingsguard Raymond Baratheon obviously didn't realize how things would change. He told Renly that the news was just to inform him not to do anything like tearing down the vote. After talking, he just prepared to leave directly. However, Renly suddenly stopped him, and slowly asked under the other person's vigilant gaze, "Why do you think Queen Visenya did this?" The Queen Mother hopes that her son Maegor will inherit the Iron Throne, not Prince Aegon. Although he felt that Renly was an enemy rather than a friend, Raymond Baratheon still replied, "She has always hoped that Prince Maegor would. She was granted the title of Prince of Dragonstone, but His Majesty did not do what she wanted, so their relationship became tense. There seems to be no need to keep this matter secret, so even though he is a member of the royal family's guard, this person has no worries about talking about it. So what do you think are the chances of her succeeding?" "She won't succeed," the King's Guard said without hesitation. "Prince Aegon is your Majesty's legal heir, not Maegor. Your Prince Aegon is currently trapped in the Riverlands by the church people." Renly reminded, by the time he knows the news, it may be too late. In history, Prince Aegon was also besieged during his post-marriage tour, but the place where he was trapped was the Westerland instead of the Riverlands. Obviously, this matter went awry for some reason. When Renly thought of this, he thought the attack he encountered in the Riverlands flashed through his mind subconsciously, but he didn't think much about it because the conversation was still going on. "That's why I'm going to inform His Highness the Prince," Raymond Baratheon said and frowned. "What is the purpose of Sir Lemon telling me this?" Renly did not answer his question directly, but answered exactly what was asked. "What do you think is the most direct way to resolve the conflict with the church?" "Burn them all to death with dragon flames." Renly was speechless for a moment with such straightforward words, and then he hurriedly said, "Don't you know what was going on in Dorne back then? The dragon flames will certainly make some people surrender, but they will also make more people feel rebellious." The other party did not speak when he heard this. Renly saw this and said, "Aegon the Conqueror used 3 dragons to defeat the Targaryen dynasty." It seemed very majestic, but few people noticed that after the dynasty was established, Aegon it took a lifetime to patrol around with dragons and scare the lords everywhere to finally consolidate this new kingdom. Even so, there are still people in Westeros who miss the days when the 7 kingdoms existed side by side. Now you use dragon flames to stimulate them. Will only sow the seeds of division. Don't you know that it is easy to avoid overt means, but it is difficult to guard against secret arrows? Then what does Sir think the solution to the church's problem is?" the bearded middle-aged man under the cloak asked. He could tell that Renly had other motives, but he was also very interested in this issue. "Trial by combat," Renly replied. "No matter how great your sin is, or how unreasonable, a trial by combat is enough to clear you of any wrongdoing. The church preaches that the power of the gods will be involved in the trial, and the gods will only let the righteous side wins. In fact, this is ridiculous, but everyone thinks so. So, if it wins the trial by combat, can the church disobey the judgment of the gods? So you think His Royal Highness should use trial by combat to get rid of the siege of the church?" These words made Renly stunned, and then he felt that this bloodline ancestor's mind was really a bit rigid. He may think of using this, or you can tell him to do so, but it is too late, and the church may not accept it. Renly shook his head and said, "The twins are far away from King's Landing. When you get there, Queen Visenya has already crowned Maegor." The other party heard this and retorted, "This is impossible. His Highness Aegon is the true heir to the Iron Throne. Maegor crowned him without permission. No lord will listen to him. Maegor is the son of Aegon the Conqueror. The Aegon you refer to is just his grandson," Renly replied. "And King Aeneas is weak and incompetent. It is difficult for his descendants to guarantee that they will have a strong character. On the contrary, Maegor, Who do you think the lords who are fed up with the rule of the weak king will want to inherit the Iron Throne? Or, in other words, those who miss the old times. Do the lords of the time hope to submit to the legitimate king honestly, or do they want to join the other side and let the Targaryens fight dog eat dog? Renly said this without any basis, and there was no relevant record in the history books, but he was just trying to deceive the other party when he brought it out at this time, and he didn't care whether there was any evidence. It just sounded like that. The Iron Throne is not something they wish to sit on, the King's Guard replied, but their tone was different from the beginning. Otherwise? Can you sit on the Iron Throne just by relying on those illusory principles and rules? As a family member of the usurper, Renly had a say in this, but he did not explain this point more, but changed the subject. When His Majesty Aenus dies of illness, it is very likely that Maegor will sit on the Iron Throne, but the biggest problem he faces is not the succession as you mentioned, but the church. After all, Maegor's bigamy incident came first, and the first his wife is also the Archbishop's niece, and it is actually him who the church is most hostile to. He said, so let's go back to the topic just now, what can we do to solve the trouble caused by the church, or in other words, how can we make the church temporarily lay down its weapons and not immediately resist the new king? Trial by combat. Yes, Maegor will definitely do this, and even if he doesn't think of it, Queen Visenya will probably think of using the trial to promote the legitimacy of her son's inheritance of the Iron Throne, and thus temporarily appease the church. The other party didn't say anything after hearing this, nor did he refute anything, but fell into deep thought. Obviously, he actually had some guesses about Maegor's future succession to the throne, but he was never willing to admit it from the bottom of his heart. The light of dusk gradually faded away, and the two people stood face to face in a small alley on the side of Junlin Fisherman's Square. One lowered his head and thought, and the other waited quietly. Soon after, the bearded Baratheon looked up at Renly. What's your purpose in saying this? As a member of the King's Guard, you have a special position. I suggest that you find someone to inform you of Prince Aegon, while you stay in King's Landing. Renly said, when Maegor is crowned, and tells those who oppose his rule when a challenge is issued, you shall stand up to him in the name of Prince Aegon. Why? Of course it's for Prince Aegon's throne. If it really develops according to your guess, then why don't I wait until Maegor and the church compete with each other? What does this have to do with you? If Maegor wins the trial, it means that his inheritance has been legalized. And if he loses, do you think that as the victorious party, those in the church will honestly follow you again? Will Prince Aegon initiate negotiations? The other party didn't speak, and Renly said again, wait until Maegor's side launches a challenge, and then you accept the challenge, so that Maegor has no room to refuse. And if you win this trial, then it will be equivalent to solving the schism in the royal family, and the church will also acknowledge the impact of the trial to some extent, and if Maegor's side refuses to execute it after you win, it will be equivalent to ignoring the judgment of the gods. In this way, you will have the opportunity to win over the church to Prince Aegon's side. This is a good thing. That's what it sounds like. The other party nodded when he heard this, and then said calmly, unfortunately, there is a high chance that I will fail. Renly smiled at this and then revealed his true purpose. So you must demand the trial of the Seven Sons. Chapter 104. The Seven Sons trial is similar to a normal combat trial, but the two parties involved become 7 versus 7. Relatively speaking, personal strength becomes less important. This kind of trial is sacred and cannot be refused easily, but it is not something that only the church can propose. Everyone can ask for it when facing accusations or making accusations, and then organize people to compete with each other. Of course, this honor does not include civilians. King's Guard Raymond Baratheon had a lot of hesitation about this. After hearing this, he did not make an immediate decision, but was going to go back to the inn where he was staying to think about it. Renly didn't force this, or it would be useless to force him. If there is really still a year left, then there is actually a lot of room for him to maneuver. But now things have suddenly become very sudden, so he can only use alternative plans. From passive to active. In terms of the church, Renly was just a talented new knight. Although he contributed a very important invention, it had nothing to do with his own combat effectiveness. On the side of King's Guard Raymond Baratheon, although Renly cannot be regarded as his only ally, he is still a point that can be exploited. So if the applicant for the trial of the Seven Sons changes from the church to the King's Guard, his chances of joining will be much greater, or in other words, Renly is sure to join from him. But this method is actually not reliable, because if you leave the church behind and go out to work alone, it is difficult to say whether it will comply with the mission goal. The mission is to participate in the church's trial of the 7 sons of Maguire in the name of the warrior son and win. Renly is indeed a warrior's son now, but if the trial was not initiated by the church, would it be considered complete even if it was a victory? So he had never made this idea before, but now he had no choice but to do it. But if the church also joins in? As he kept thinking about this question along the way, he unknowingly came within the confines of the church. In the dim night, as he stepped onto the square at the top of Rennis Hills, the absent-minded Renly suddenly heard the sound of chaotic footsteps. He looked sideways and happened to find an emaciated figure falling to the ground with a thud. However, under Renly's gaze, this man climbed up without any hesitation and continued running towards him. His messy long black hair was spread out, and he was wearing a white robe. At first glance, he looked like a monster. But when you get closer, the cheeks exposed by the person behind you appear to be quite friendly. This person was naturally a mute nun, and Renly recognized him at first sight. Her nose was a little red, and there was a bloody scratch on her forehead. Now it was slowly bleeding out, but the face that came close to her was always full of smiles. When she came closer, she pulled up the corner of Renly's clothes with one hand and pulled up the other corner of Renly's clothes. With one hand, he handed him a mint leaf. She seemed to be smiling, but her eyes seemed a little uneasy as she handed mint forward, as if she was afraid that Renly wouldn't accept it. This look made Renly a little stunned, and then he vaguely understood something. Normally, he would teach her how to read in the evening, but today's conversation lasted for a long time, and it was already past the normal time. This person might be a little impatient. So he reached out and took the mint leaf and stuffed it into his mouth. At the same time, he raised his hand and rubbed the other person's hair, which made Lia's already messy long hair even worse. However, the little nun did not express dissatisfaction because of this. The smile on the face covered by the messy long hair widened even wider, as if she was trying to please. This expression was completely different from the initial one when he was provoked and ran away, but it made Renly look quite uncomfortable. You should learn to get used to my absence, because sooner or later you will have to live alone. Muttering, he motioned for Lia to sit on a nearby bench, and he took out the handkerchief and a box of brown-red ointment he carried with him, and began to treat the wound on her forehead. The anointing oil is called Myr Fire. It is produced in Myr, the craft capital of the free trade city. Its effect is to burn, clean and disinfect wounds. Because there will be bumps and bruises during the training, Renly always carries this kind of thing with him. Now just bring it and use it. The other party was very honest now, sitting there obediently, letting Renly apply this hot medicinal oil on her forehead. Although her little head moved as a result, she still maintained her sitting posture with her legs together and her hands covering each other on her lower abdomen. Very good. This was a sitting position that Renly had taught her many times to prevent Rhea from touching other people's things while sitting. Now she looks pretty decent. At first glance, she looks like a little lady. Renly is quite pleased with this. But before I leave, I will find you a reliable nun to take care of you. By then you should be able to simply communicate with others through text. No, I should have settled you down before the trial, otherwise, if anything happens it would be bad if I died, and I can't let you stay here. Then Maguire is a madman. He won the trial and still used dragons to kill people. He deserved a bad death later. He muttered while applying the medicine, as if he was explaining the funeral arrangements. Rhea looked at him blankly, unable to understand. Seeing this, Renly shook his head. After applying the ointment, he did not leave. Instead, he sat on the chair next to the girl, leaning against her and falling into deep thought. One of them felt sad and didn't want to speak, the other looked at each other curiously but couldn't speak. The atmosphere was quite peaceful for a while. The temple building at night is like a dormant monster, and the closed door is like the monster's eyes. It does not move during rest, as if it has been dead for a long time. Only the sound of insects and the sound of water flowing from the fountain statue in the center of the square are endless, bringing a hypnotic power. It is midsummer now, and the climate is not cold. Thinking about it, he is a little confused, and the confused Renly fell asleep. He had a bizarre dream. In the dream, he turned into a powerful knight and killed all sides in the arena. Finally, he awakened the ability of telepathy and became a master of language. But the environment of this dream changed immediately. He seemed to become a mute, and then ran to be a teacher. As a result, after gesturing for a long time, a group of elementary school students in school uniforms below still couldn't understand. He was a little angry and suddenly thought of using a mobile phone, but when he took it out of his pocket, the dream disappeared instantly. The hazy mind revived and everything in the dream passed away quickly, and finally only a trace of afterglow remained in the heart, but it became more and more blurred. When he opened his eyes, a ray of light bloomed in the sky, proving that a new day had arrived. The surroundings were quite quiet. Renly, who had regained his consciousness, thought of something, so he turned his head and found that Rhea had not left. Now she was sitting on a chair, with her hands folded and her head bowed in prayer, looking very quiet. Renly had discovered this habit of Rhea since the beginning before he really came into contact with her, and he didn't care about it. It was just that he was very patient after waking up, or he didn't want to think about anything serious, so he observed it a few more times, and a discovery made him suddenly startled. Because he suddenly realized that normal nuns would only pray in front of the corresponding statues or representatives of the seven gods, but the direction the girl in front of him was facing was the male sculpture in the center of the square. Renly was puzzled by this, so when the other party finished praying and looked over, he raised his hand and pointed at the statue, and then drew a question mark on the ground. This behavior represents asking what this thing is. In the past, Renly taught this to let the other party ask questions when facing unfamiliar things, and then he would answer them with some behavior. Now it is used on Rhea in reverse, and she can understand it. So she picked up the branch and squatted on the ground as if she was ready to write, but after hesitating for a long time, she didn't write a word, and finally looked up at Renly, her eyes full of trouble and confusion. Renly understood that she didn't know how to express it again, or she hadn't learned the corresponding expression vocabulary. He was a little disappointed, but he didn't care much, but the other party didn't give up. After sitting back in the chair, she pulled Renly's sleeve and looked at him, mumbling for a long time, and finally grunted out a syllable. Rhea couldn't speak just because she couldn't hear the sound, not because she had no possibility of speaking. In the past contact, this person often made various inexplicable words, some of which sounded like some random babbling, and some of which seemed to match the common language vaguely. Renly guessed that it might be that Rhea imitated the mouth movements of others when they spoke. Usually, such imitations are difficult to recognize, but today it sounded different. Compared with the usual blurriness, it can't be said to be extremely clear, but it can still be understood. Because of this, Renly was a little stunned. Because this syllable means father in the common language. Chapter 105. The light of dawn radiated slowly from the sky, and monks gradually appeared in the deserted square. They were walking or talking to each other. The scene looked vigorous. The towering statue in the center of the square was half covered by the morning light, as if emitting brilliant colors, and it also looked quite sacred. On the benches at the edge of the square, the atmosphere was a little subtle. As if she was afraid that Renly didn't understand what she was saying, Rhea said this word several times in a row, and then looked at him expectantly, as if she hoped that Renly could understand what she meant. In response, Renly stared at the young face in front of him for a long time, and finally patted the other's forehead with a smile, thinking that this must be a nun who taught her when she was a child. After all, many people would not directly say that they didn't know who her parents were when talking to a child. There would always be a proper explanation, such as picking them up from a dung heap or kidnapping them on the street. And it seems understandable to throw the pot on the statue that depends on the existence of the temple. Feeling the gentle touch on her head, Rhea thought that Renly understood, so she sighed lightly, and then a close smile bloomed on her face. At this time, a ray of morning light just covered the other's tender face. The smiling face under the messy black hair made Renly's movements suddenly stagnate. He felt a sense of déjà vu, so he hurriedly reached out to pull away the long hair that covered Rhea's face and began to look at her carefully. She still looked the same with a perky nose, round face, and a few freckles on her cheeks. Because of Renly's teaching, she would wash her face and brush her teeth every day, so her face looked clean, and her teeth were also brushed white and shiny. At this time, a blush gradually appeared on her cheeks, as if she was a little embarrassed to be looked at. But she did not resist or express dissatisfaction, but showed a hint of curiosity. A pair of large golden eyes blinked at the big blonde in front of her, obviously puzzled by Renly's behavior at this time. Renly also felt puzzled. He didn't know if it was a psychological effect, but he suddenly found that the girl's face seemed to be somewhat similar to his previous identity, except that her skin was white instead of brown, and her eyes were unusual in color. Impossible, I didn't do anything, how could I leave offspring, and the age doesn't match? He murmured to himself, but couldn't help frowning, so that the girl who was originally tilting her head to look at him lied in her heart, and she might think that she accidentally made Renly angry again, so she raised her fingers to smooth her eyebrows. The speed of this little hand rushing over was so fast that Renly almost got poked in the eye by her, and at the same time, he was quite surprised by his face being moved around, so he quickly raised his hand to grab the other's arm to signal to stop. As a result, Rhea might think that Renly was expressing dissatisfaction, so she hurriedly took out a small ironkin from the sleeve pocket of her nun's robe with her other hand and handed it to him. She hesitated anxiously for a while, and her eyes became more and more moist, as if she was about to cry. This jar has always been used to hold insects. Usually, Rhea treasures it very much. She would never throw it away even if she was asked to. But now, she gave it to him without hesitation. Renly felt mixed emotions, but knew that he couldn't continue like this, so he didn't take the jar. He raised his hand and touched her head to comfort her, and smiled at the same time, indicating that he was not angry. Rhea didn't seem to believe it. She kept stuffing the jar into Renly's arms, as if she would not give up until he took it. Renly had no choice but to accept it, and then she burst into tears and laughed. Then, while Renly was not paying attention, she carefully looked at the jar again, as if she was reluctant to give it up. But when Renly turned his eyes back, Rhea blinked and smiled at him again. She seemed to think that Renly would be fine if he accepted her precious jar, so even though Renly seemed a little silent when he asked her to go back to her residence to rest, Rhea still followed him with a smile, and even pestered Renly to write several new words for her in her own room, looking very studious. Finally, when Renly left and could no longer see his back, she reluctantly withdrew her gaze from behind the window, and then went back to bed and hugged her washed khaki bedding and fell asleep peacefully. But Rhea could relax, but Renly could not. He was still thinking about the syllable he heard before. Rationally speaking, he didn't think he would have offspring in this world. After all, he didn't do anything at all, but the more he looked at that face, the more familiar it seemed. Although it had been more than 40 years since he was a Dornishman, that was only counted here. In his memory, it had not actually been a few months, and his impression of it could not be wrong. But it must be a mistake, otherwise it could not be explained. Or is he still alive after he was separated from the object of possession? This doesn't seem right. If he is really alive, then as the one who saved Queen Targaryen, he can't have left any traces other than Renly. Was he killed by the jealous conqueror? Or did he have offspring before I possessed him? On the way back to his residence, various thoughts flashed through his mind, and they all made sense, but deep in his heart there was another thought that he couldn't get rid of. What if this is true? What if Rhea is really his descendant, or is her existence related to him? After all, the name Son of Chaos could never have appeared in the original Westeros, but it happened to appear. Isn't this because I am also an outsider? If this is the case, then what do the Sons of Anarchy represent? How was she born? Son of Chaos, Son of Chaos. Renly had many thoughts for a moment and seemed very absent-minded. While walking, his drooping right hand accidentally touched a cold touch object in the money bag beside him. With a thought, he pulled it down and picked it up to check. This is an ironkin that can be held in one hand. The whole is grey. There is a black and purple rope tied to it for easy hanging on the body. Its surface has a vague feeling of rust caused by years of friction. It feels heavy when held in the hand. It seems that there are a lot of things in it. This is the jar that Rhea gave him before. She can always be seen stuffing bugs into it, but it is rare to see her taking bugs out of it. Renly had no interest in this before, but now he was curious about the mute girl's behavior, so he opened the tin can and looked inside in the morning light. Logically speaking, there should be a bunch of bugs or bug corpses inside. Renly was already prepared to be smelled by the smell, but when he took a closer look, he found that there was no dirt at all inside. There are 3 semi-arc concave discs that look very delicate. Under the morning light, they shine with a faint luster as if they were made of gold. This looks like an eggshell. Renly thought blankly, then took out one of the pieces and looked at it carefully, his eyes narrowed unconsciously, and finally, an idea suddenly emerged. Rhea believed the statue was her father, but she couldn't have been born knowing that. Who told Rhea? Chapter 106. The information about the mute girl's life was very simple, or rather monotonous, and Renly had already found out about it. She was originally an abandoned baby adopted by a high-status old nun. Later, the old nun named Melia died, and Rhea became a little-noticed child. She grew up in this church year after year with food and clothing provided by the church. She could not do anything else except make trouble. The only thing the girl could do was wash clothes. It seemed that she was the old nun who adopted her. Taught. Because of this, the church management once wanted her to be responsible for doing laundry for other nuns to prove the value of her labor. Later, the matter fell through due to some obvious reasons. However, another nun named Ada in the church seems to have a close relationship with the dead old nun, and Sister Ada is the leader of all the nuns, so even if many things Lia does are very excessive, she still, instead of driving it out, it is often maintained and taken care of from time to time. Renly couldn't calm down because he realized that there was something wrong with Raya's life experience. Another question that followed made him unable to calm down. So he didn't care that it was still early. He had just reached the door of his house when he changed direction again and turned towards walk to another place. Having lived in this residential area for a long time, he had some knowledge of some celebrities here, so he knew that the nun named Ada should be watering the flowers in the flower garden. Sure enough, when Renly walked along the intricate alleyways of the residential area to a small open space surrounded by buildings, he saw the person who was highly respected in the hearts of the nuns. But when Renly asked about the nun who adopted Rhea, the other party's answer was beyond his expectation. I'm actually not familiar with Melia. She comes from the eastern continent. The old nun with black and white mixed hair said slowly while watering the flowers, because she funded the church a lot of money, so we all respect her, but she is very withdrawn and rarely talks to us except when she gets along with Raya's child. The eastern continent is the abbreviation for the continent across the narrow sea. Its official name is Essos, which is the continent where the free trade city is located. What does she look like? Renly asked. There is no hair. Half of the face has been burned. The rest of the face is very blurry. It took too long. The old man, who looked to be in his 50s, answered slowly. As he spoke, his skinny fingers touched a flower that looked delicate and lustful. Drops of red rose. I remember it being beautiful. Renly frowned when he heard this, and then suddenly asked, since we are not familiar with each other, why do you take care of Rhea so much? They all say it is because of an old relationship. Because I have much more patience than ordinary nuns, sir. The other party laughed when he heard this. What you once said is correct. We should not ignore the poor people in front of us, not to mention the legacy left by Sister Melia. The money is enough to atone for Raya's many sins. As she spoke, she straightened up and watched with relief as the originally messy flower bed was made neat and beautiful again. At the same time, she said to Renly, many people have tried to contact Raya's child, but it has been useless. I'm not sure how you did it, but since you can change her, sir, I hope you will take more care of her. She is a poor child. Sister Melia was there before, and I can give her some money after Melia's death. Some care, but who will take care of her after I die? She definitely can't do it herself. She then rambled on for a while, and Renly listened quietly. When the last words were said, he bowed to the old man, then turned and left. After looking at his back thoughtfully, the other party shook his head, then took out a bag of flower seeds from his pocket and got busy again. He didn't learn much from Sister Ada, but what he learned made a certain suspicion in Renly's mind more serious. So when he returned to the house, he directly pushed the sleeping bald boy on the bed until the other party mumbled come to life. It was still too early, and there was nothing in the surrounding environment except for the chirping of birds. So after being woken up, the boy looked confused. Then he rubbed his eyes and answered the question that Renly had just asked in a slightly annoyed tone. I even said I didn't know. My father might not even know what happened to my grandmother. How could I know? Think about it carefully. Renly squatted beside his bed and asked seriously. You don't know if you think about it carefully. The boy replied with a stiff neck, but after the other party squinted his eyes, he still curled his lips unwillingly, and then pondered for a long time in a daze before finally holding it back. In one sentence. It seemed that my grandmother had a quarrel with my grandfather before she disappeared. He said hesitantly, it seemed that the quarrel was very fierce, and then she left and never came back. Then what? Then I didn't know. The boy said, maybe he went back to Dragonstone Island first? Whenever our family members quarrel, one of them will definitely run back to Dragonstone Island. My grandmother should be no exception. Later, she may have gone to the eastern continent. She seems to often going to the eastern continent, my father said she was always interested in it. What about other things? Is there anything weird? Weird. The boy pondered for a long time, and finally said, She has a dragon egg that cannot be hatched no matter how hard it is hatched. Is this weird? Golden? Maybe, I don't know. As he said this, the boy suddenly had an idea and thought of some special news, but he hesitated because it might be suspected of slandering his elders. But after looking at Renly's serious look, the boy still spoke. When I was a child, my grandfather told me that my grandmother might be crazy. She spent all day studying magic spells that were useless. My father didn't say that, but he said that my grandmother always liked to think about some things. For example, she thought that secular power was not a big deal, and learning magic was the right way, because magic could make people become anyone, and could also replace anyone. She also always said that her egg was not a dead egg, but an egg full of life, which was pregnant with a very powerful dragon. Did the egg hatch later? I don't know, my grandmother took it away. It should not have hatched. This kind of thing can't be concealed, but I haven't heard of an extra dragon anywhere. Renly nodded, and when he saw that the boy really couldn't say anything, he patted his forehead and let him rest. The boy egg lost his sleepiness. Seeing the blonde knight's absent-minded look, he asked curiously, "Why does the seer always ask about these things? Is there an elder in your family who knows my grandmother?" "Almost." Renly replied, stood up and walked to his bed, saying at the same time, "Sleep for a while, and when you wake up, come with me to the cemetery in the September." Cemetery? The boy was stunned when he heard it. "What are you going there for?" "To visit an old friend." Chapter 107. There are several cemeteries in King's Landing, scattered in all directions, and there is also a cemetery dedicated to burying clergy at the top of Rennis Hill, which is located at the innermost of the residential area, not far from their residence. The boy instinctively has a bit of awe for the dead in the cemetery, and is deeply poisoned by various legends and ghost stories, so much so that he was not happy when he was dragged here. However, after walking into it, his face became solemn, perhaps infected by the atmosphere here, or perhaps he felt that there was nothing scary here, and then he returned to his former steadiness. This cemetery on the hill is blocked by a circle of wooden fences. There are rows of tombstones in the cemetery, most of which are made of granite, with the 7-pointed star logo carved on the top. The grey and simple shape, at first glance, they seem to be exactly the same. However, if you look closely, you can still find different names engraved on the surface of the tombstones, but they look very shallow. This seems to be a custom of the Church of the Seven Gods. The most representative of this custom is the successive archbishops of the Church. After they take office as archbishops, they will give up their own names and only address each other as the archbishop, because he has become the spokesperson of the gods. Fortunately, these dead people have not completely given up their own names and become servants of the gods, so Renly was able to find the tombstone of Sister Maria. It was one of the many stone tombstones mixed in. There was nothing special or outstanding about it. Because there were often nuns to take care of it, there was no dust or cobwebs on it. The only thing worth mentioning was that there was an old oak tree growing next to this tombstone. The oak tree had lush branches, and several black crows squatted in it. When they saw someone coming below, they were not scared away. Instead, they shouted arrogantly a few times, which seemed very noisy. This also broke the quiet atmosphere in the deserted cemetery. But they stopped calling after a short while, because the two people below didn't even look over, which seemed to make the crows lose interest, so they combed their feathers on the tree, and their dark eyes kept looking at the two figures under the tree through the leaves, as if they were thinking of something. Renly ignored these, or didn't care. At this time, he stood quietly in front of this very ordinary tombstone, with a dazed look. The son of chaos, the golden eggshell, the dragon egg from the east continent, with a high status, and a powerful dragon. All the clues came together, although there were still many puzzles and it was incredible, but combined with the situation before he left, he still guessed some things. That is, the old nun who adopted Rhea might be Rennis. And Rhea was the egg. But that strong and fragile figure at the time, has it turned into a handful of dust in just a few months? Being there, it is hard to notice the flowers withering as time goes by, but when you look back after leaving this place, you will find that only a short time has passed and the old friends have gone forever. Renly's mind is empty at this time. He thinks he may think about many things, but in fact he is not thinking about anything now. He stands quietly in front of the tombstone for a long time, not seeing the past, not caring about the future, only the tombstone in front of him, the oak tree beside him, and the quiet atmosphere around him occupy his entire mind. Finally, he put a bunch of white roses in his hand in front of the tombstone, then patted the boy's forehead, asked him to follow suit and bowed, and then turned and left. Leaving now? The boy following behind him was very confused. What else? Do you want to live here? I thought the sergeant would talk for a long time. I've seen many people talk a lot when they worship the dead. What can you say to a stone? No one can hear you even if you say it. Having said so, Renly suddenly paused, then turned around under the boy's strange gaze and walked back to the tombstone. After a moment of silence, he sang a song called The Beautiful Girl in Summer. This song is a folk song that is widely circulated in Westeros. The melody is cheerful and the rhythm is simple. The beautiful girl in the lyrics is pure and beautiful, but the song sounded from the cemetery, which gave this beauty a layer of sadness. The bald boy beside him listened silently until the last sound dissipated. He then asked curiously, "The sergeant can sing? Why didn't I find it before?" Renly looked at him and didn't respond. The news that King Aenus was seriously ill did not hide it from the Seven Kingdoms for long, because he died of illness soon after. As if they had been prepared for this, King Aenus's brother, Maegor Targaryen, suddenly returned from the exiled free trade city, and took advantage of his nephew Aegon being besieged in the Riverlands by the Church's armed forces to be crowned king on Dragonstone, becoming Maegor I. He was the third king to sit on the Iron Throne, and also a king who had obtained the throne illegitimately. A large number of ravens spread from Dragonstone, spreading the news of the new king's coronation throughout the Seven Kingdoms, and the Church was very angry. Because Maegor not only violated the previous punishment and returned from the exile, but also ignored the long-standing inheritance law and claimed the throne without authorization, bypassing his nephew. Coupled with the various deeds of the past, the people in the Church were all indignant about this, and were ready to fight to the death with this king who was even more monstrous than Aenus. In this atmosphere, the member of the King's Guard secretly contacted Renly, obviously stimulated by what happened. Renly went to discuss with him for a long time, and finally the two parties reached a cooperation. Soon after, things happened exactly as Renly expected, or according to the original historical trajectory. On a gloomy morning, a loud dragon roar suddenly sounded from outside the coastline, and became louder and louder. When Maegor I rode Balerion, the dragon known as the Black Death, to the top of Visenya Hills to rule, thousands of royalists hidden in the city responded to his call and gathered in droves. The Church attaches great importance to this, but the other party does not directly conflict with it. Instead, it speaks out and accepts the challenge of anyone who disobeys his rule. Maegor's purpose is easy to guess, but the Church is confident in it. In other words, except for dragons, the Targaryen family is not taken seriously by the Church at all. Nancy Tabek, the leader of the Sons of Warriors, was therefore ready to challenge. However, he seemed to be a little drunk from the wine he drank the night before, so he was still in a daze after waking up. When he went to challenge, someone was already one step ahead of him. The challenger was Raymond Baratheon, the King's Guard of the late King Aenus. He openly opposed Maegor's coronation as king. He believed that Maegor's bigamy and the inheritance of the Iron Throne over his nephew Aegon were illegal, so he raised the challenge, but asked to expand the challenge. The more sacred judgment of the Seven Sons. Maegor's side was forced to agree to the challenge, and Raymond Baratheon called on the righteous men of King's Landing to join him. In public, a warrior's son responded to his call, and this warrior's son was named Lemon. It was the middle of the 41st year of the conquest calendar, and it had been nearly 3 months since Renly entered this historical copy. Chapter 108. Who allowed you to make a decision without consent? In the meeting room of the September, a circle of people sat on both sides of the meeting table and stared at the blonde knight at the door. Everyone looked unhappy and the overall atmosphere was very tense. It was a familiar scene, but unlike the last time when rumors were a minor matter, this time the incident was much more serious. The time when Raymond, the King's Guard, initiated the trial of the Seven Sons was in the afternoon, and he had one night to prepare the manpower. The next day, that is, tomorrow, the trial by combat would officially begin. So Renly was facing a difficulty right now. The one who initiated the questioning was Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the Sons of Warriors. He was originally very annoyed because he was slightly embarrassed by drinking, and now someone in the Knights actually rashly intervened in the internal fight of the Targaryen royal family without consent. How could he not be angry? You know, they are hostile to all Targaryens, not just one of them. It's the gods in heaven. Renly's words were shocking as soon as he opened his mouth, without any of the responses that people imagined, but this did not affect the anger of some people. The gods in heaven believe that families with incest are monsters, and the gods have never allowed us to stand on the side of monsters. A bald monk answered expressionlessly. Renly thought, why don't you talk to the archbishop who crowned the conqueror, but now saying this is purely a matter of arguing, and it will make the other party angry, so he followed this topic to refute. But the gods require us to uphold justice. He had prepared for this before he was summoned, so the topic was endless. Maguire's succession order was lower than his nephew Aegon, and now he hastily crowned himself, which is not in accordance with the rules. In addition, his mother Visenya used poison and despicable means to kill the previous king Aenus. Such a blatant rebellion against justice, shouldn't they be tried? The latter he mentioned was a rumor that gradually spread in the city. There was no evidence, but it was enough to constitute one of the reasons for the trial and accusation. After hearing this, another red-haired knight said, of course we need to participate in the trial, but we don't need to join the Targaryen side. Standing on the side of the monster to resist another monster? Whoever wins or loses is contrary to our goal, but you rashly got involved. Yes, we can start a second game after this trial. Another knight said, the second game between the church and the Targaryens. Does this mean that you are ready to ignore the judgment of the gods? Renly said, as we all know, the trial by combat is the result of the gods, and the trial of 7 sons is more sacred. The reason for the challenge by the King's Guard is bigamy and inheritance. If Maguire wins, should we recognize bigamy and Maguire's inheritance rights as legal? Before these people spoke, Renly said, or are some of the things we have been promoting for thousands of years just talk, and in fact it depends on whether it is in line with the interests of the church before it will be recognized. This is a bit explicit, and the bald monk subconsciously refuted it after hearing this. We are servants of the gods, and we only protect the glory of the gods. So in the gods' admonitions, did Maguire's actions damage their glory? Renly asked quickly, if so, what's wrong with me joining in? Some situations are very special, Lemon. Sir Murray, who was sitting quietly on the side, said, we certainly need to protect the glory of the gods in heaven, but we can't rush into it, and you rashly joining in is really too reckless. I don't understand what is so-called recklessness. I only know that Maguire is evil and has no right to sit on the Iron Throne, so I want to fight him. Renly's voice sounded righteous. On the surface, he looked like a church knight who really defended justice, or a fool who didn't know what was good for him. Sir Murray was a little angry because of this. How can you guarantee that you can defeat Maguire after you go up? If the gods really uphold justice, then I will definitely win. Renly said without hesitation, because victory only belongs to the side of justice. The gods may not look at you, you may still die on the spot, you. Then let me die in the trial. A true knight should not fear life and death, but should have the faith he must uphold, and that is obviously not compromise. After that, he said directly without waiting for the people at the table to speak again, my lords, if you think my actions will cause trouble to the church, then I will participate in the trial in the name of Lemon, the illegitimate son of the Osgrey family, instead of the son of a warrior. As he said this, he bowed slightly and saluted, then turned around and left without hesitation, leaving a group of church leaders looking at each other in bewilderment. Finally, the red-haired knight said angrily, look, everyone, this guy is so disregarding the overall situation, and he has no sense of shame? I suggest that he be expelled from the warrior's son directly, so that we will not be dragged down by him. The words behind him could be heard faintly. At this time, a knight guarding the door looked at Renly with a complicated look after he walked out, admiring, surprised, and annoyed. This represents the views of many people on the blonde knight. Renly ignored this. When he walked away, his face was expressionless, but he was actually thinking about it in his heart. In the end, the church was unlikely to allow the trial to happen, or it was impossible to allow the trial to be beyond their control. The reason is very simple. After countless years of propaganda, the trial by combat basically represents the judgment of the gods. This kind of trial can even ignore secular laws. The one with the bigger fist has the right. Many evil people have used this to wash away their crimes, and it has been tried and tested. And the trial of the 7 sons is more sacred than a simple trial by combat. So just as Renly said in the room, if the church really allows this trial to happen, then after the result comes out, will they admit it or deny it? The biggest possibility is that the church will end, or be forced to end, and they can't let Maguire win in public. Renly thinks there will be no surprises on this point. He has been thinking about this since he put drugs in the wine of the leader of the warrior sons. And he is not worried about being expelled from the church, or he is not worried about being expelled before this trial. He announced his participation in the trial in the name of the warrior sons in public, even in front of the enemy, so the fact that he joined the trial is basically unchangeable. Then, expelling him from the church at this juncture is useless, but will cause criticism. Being called here now is just because the church is too angry. They are angry that the King's Guard took the lead, that Renly acted without considering the overall situation, and that he was led by the nose. Knowing this, Renly naturally doesn't need to be polite, because as long as his attitude is a little soft, a series of questions and reprimands will obviously come, so it's better to be tough and then talk nonsense. Anyway, he doesn't need the identity of the son of a warrior after the trial. Of course, all this is risky. Although the plan is well thought out, there is a great possibility that the church will not play by the rules. Before things really happen, no one dares to guarantee what the specific development will be like. So it may be a mistake to lose everything. Renly is mentally prepared for this. If the church really does not choose to join this trial, it may directly expel him from the church. Then the question is the name of the son of a warrior equivalent to the identity of the son of a warrior? If others think he is the son of a warrior, then did he participate in the trial in the name of the son of a warrior? In other words, he did ask to join the trial in the name of the son of a warrior, which many onlookers knew at the time, and the news must have spread quickly. So if he was not a warrior in the middle of the process, did it meet the requirements? If it met the requirements, it would be good, but if he failed, he could also gain something, because it would allow him to understand some mission rules. Of course, it would be better not to fail. After all, it would be too uneconomical to spend so much time preparing for this mission and simply understand the rules. However, the premise of all this is to win, but Renly did not dare to guarantee this. His initial idea was to keep honing his skills, and then see what level he could reach in the end and then formulate a battle plan based on this. Unfortunately, plans cannot keep up with changes. His skills related to knights are obviously not comparable to those of senior masters, and now he can only rely on the lance rack and some non-knight related things. Thinking of this, he has stepped into the residential area, and at this moment, a thin white figure suddenly rushed over from the shadow of the corner. Renly had a headache when he saw this. Chapter 109. Since the last time she let her go, Rhea has become particularly clingy. Whenever Renly is late for a moment, she will become anxious and even run to where he lives to look for him. Maybe there is no concept of lateness in her mind, but only coming or not coming. Renly felt very complicated about this. Because of his father, he always felt awkward in front of her, and he didn't really think that he was her real father. After all, this man seemed to be born from an egg, but I vaguely feel that the person in front of me has become a little different in my heart. It is no longer a simple but complex mission goal. However, this did not affect his daily teachings. Although his state of mind was completely different from the past, his daily performance was no different from before, except for a hint of sadness. It's just that the past 2 days have been so busy that Renly can't care about anything else. He had given many instructions, but the other party obviously didn't listen, or didn't understand. This made Renly feel helpless, but facing the aggrieved girl in front of him, he couldn't bear to feel angry and could only choose to comfort her. Lemon went to pick mint. He wrote something on the ground that the other party could understand, and at the same time took out a few mint leaves that he carried every day and handed them to the other party. He was glad that he had started to have the habit of carrying mint leaves with him. Unfortunately, the other party didn't take it, but just squatted next to him, staring at him with a hint of resentment. Renly saw this and wrote, "Lemon is training." Because the girl had been to the training ground, she could understand this word, but she still had no reaction after writing it. Seeing this, Renly wanted to write a third sentence, but a hand stretched out in front of him, which made him move involuntarily. His eyes looked at the slender arm full of bites, redness, scratches, and the pile of blood in her palm. The dead insect was crushed into a ball and was stunned for a moment before accepting the gift. The girl then raised her hand to rub her tearful eyes, then pulled Renly's sleeve and bumped his arm affectionately with her head. Looking at the other party's smiling face, Renly looked slightly dazed. For some reason, he suddenly had the idea of giving up the long-planned trial qualification and dragging the other person to a quiet place to concentrate on teaching, but then he suppressed this inexplicable impulse deep in his heart. After such a painstaking plan, there are basically no other problems at the moment, except for the last hurdle. How could it be possible to just give up? So he stayed there for a while, racked his brains and taught the other party a few understandable new words, and then wrote good night on the ground. The girl nodded reluctantly, and was then sent back to his residence by the blonde knight. It was getting late at this time, so he immediately returned to his house, preparing to rest and face tomorrow's trial by combat. As soon as he entered the room, he found that his servant Ege was not asleep yet, and was sitting on a small bench. In a dull daze, after Renly walked in, he couldn't wait to ask. "Sir, do you really want to participate in the trial of the Seven Sons tomorrow?" When the news of King Aenus' death came, the boy hugged the quilt and cried loudly. But the next day, he surprisingly returned to his daily steadiness, but he began to have the habit of being in a daze, and every time he fell into a daze his little face looked full of sadness. "Of course." Renly nodded. "Besides you and Sir Raymond, who else is participating?" Egg asked, with a worried look on his face. "It's hard to tell at the moment," Renly replied as he untied his cloak and threw it onto the wooden bed. "But I guess the church will side with us. Because you convinced them. It has nothing to do with me. It's all the church's own decision." As Renly said this, he couldn't help but sigh when he saw the dull look on the other person's face, then changed the topic and asked another question. "Which of you Targaryens is against Maegor?" "Towards Maegor." The boy was stunned for a moment, and then replied smoothly, "Who would turn to him except his mother? So besides Maegor, who can ride a dragon, there is only one Visenya. The old woman has not been able to ride a dragon for many years. She is too old." The boy did not use any honorifics when talking about Visenya, and he was obviously hostile. "So Maegor is the only one who can ride a dragon?" "Yes." The boy replied, and then asked, "Are you afraid that tomorrow's trial will be fraudulent?" "I don't think that will be the case. If he wanted to use the dragon, he would not take the initiative to challenge." Renly nodded, but what he was actually thinking about was after the trial was over. The reason why he asked this was naturally because the victorious side in history belonged to Maegor, but after the victory, Maegor did not give up. After being seriously injured and comatose for nearly a month, he ignored the effects of the completion of the trial and rode the dragon directly. The entire Temple of Remembrance was burned to the ground, along with the 700 sons of warriors who were praying inside. This behavior led to a complete explosion of conflict between the two parties, and war broke out throughout Westeros. It was not until the era of Jaehaerys, which was the future reign of the little boy in front of him, that this conflict completely came to an end. The reason why Renly asked this was naturally because he was afraid that history would still happen as before after defeat, but he was also worried about whether the enemy would jump over the wall in a hurry if he won. But now it sounds like the only one on the other side who can ride a dragon is Maegor, so as long as they consider killing the other side during the trial, basically nothing like that will happen. The boy egg didn't know what the knight was thinking about. Seeing the blonde knight thinking, he hesitated to speak, but finally couldn't help asking. "Can I ask why, sir? This trial has nothing to do with you. Why do you want to participate?" "For justice," Renly answered. This statement may fool others, but Egg, who knows him a little, is half believing and half doubting. However, he didn't ask much, but said seriously, "Anyway, thank you, sir, thank you for fighting for us." The bald boy's little adult look made Renly speechless, but then he thought of something and suddenly said, "If you want to thank me, promise me one thing." "What is it?" the boy asked seriously. "If I die unfortunately, please take good care of Rhea for me," he said. In fact, he wanted to find Sister Ada at first. After all, she was an experienced old man, more stable and kind. But she left the temple for some reason, and no one knew where she went. Rhea? Why does the seer care so much about that mute? The boy was very puzzled when he heard this. It is natural that he did not know what others knew. He even met Rhea several times later and knew what Renly was doing, so the boy was very curious why Renly cared about such an annoying guy. Shouldn't normal people hate, reject, or ignore it? She is my half-sister. Renly did not want to tell the truth, nor did he talk about the so-called redemption words, but pretended to be serious and said, "I observed for a long time and finally confirmed that it was her. I originally came to King's Landing to find her, but I didn't tell anyone, so I asked you to help me take care of her." This made the boy a little confused, but seeing Renly's serious look, he reacted instantly. "No one knows this. Even she doesn't know it herself, you are the first one," Renly replied. The boy pursed his lips when he heard this, and suddenly asked, "Are we friends, seer?" Of course, so you must help your friends. I swear. Chapter 110. That night, Renly told the boy a lot of things, and after ensuring that he could remember them, he fell asleep with a little peace of mind. And the development of things did not exceed his expectations. Before dawn the next day, Renly was awakened by Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the warriors' sons. After a conversation, he was sent to the city to invite Kingsguard Raymond Baratheon to discuss the trial at noon today. What this means is self-evident. Renly quickly found Kingsguard Raymond, who was living in a hotel in the city. The two had planned to drag the church into the water, and Raymond deliberately avoided many people who were indignant and wanted to participate, so he naturally would not refuse such an invitation. Renly brought him back to the Temple of Thoughts smoothly. The most important thing is to ensure the safety of Sir Raymond. When the morning light gradually appeared, a total of 7 fully armed knights stood in a circle under the statue in the temple square and began to discuss the upcoming trial. Surprisingly, Renly knew all these people. Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the warriors' sons, the training officer Knight Owen, the humorous twins of the Caswell family, the serious Knight Murray, and their 2 Baratheons. If Sir Raymond, who accused Maegor, dies, then this trial is equivalent to declaring the other party's victory, so we must avoid this. Leader Nancy Tarbeck spoke with a serious face, and the people around him who were listening with helmets in their arms were also full of serious expressions. The person involved, Raymond Baratheon, bowed to them and saluted to express his gratitude. We don't know who the enemy has summoned at present, but we can roughly guess that Wit of the Roston family, Dales of the Darkland family, Ron, the bastard of Maiden Spring City, and Crabclaw Peninsula. After saying some names, Leader Nancy changed the subject. But no matter who it is, our chances of winning are very high, because we have what the enemy doesn't have. As he said, he glanced at Renly, his eyes were mixed with anger and relief, and his emotions were very complicated. The others were in a similar mood, except for Raymond Baratheon of the Kingsguard, who was a little confused about it. He didn't know about the lance stand. As long as there are no mistakes in the charge, we can basically determine the outcome in one round. At the very least, we can deal with more than half of the enemies, and then the other half will naturally not be a concern. This made the people around smile. It takes a long time to simply cast a breastplate, but if the original breastplate is melted and a small part that is not too big is added, it will be relatively simple. So although it didn't take long, they were basically equipped with that kind of special auxiliary parts. But to take advantage of this, we should make sure that our weapons can hit the enemy more easily, so I think it is more appropriate to use a 12-foot-long justing lance instead of an 8-foot-long iron-tipped lance. Justing lances are too fragile, easy to break, and cannot penetrate armor. As long as we can ensure that all enemies are knocked off their horses, then victory will naturally belong to us. As they continued to talk, warrior sons gradually gathered around them, but these people did not rush to approach and disturb them, but watched from a distance. They all knew about the trial of the 7 sons today, and they all knew the meaning of the success or failure of these 7 people. The 7 knights turned a blind eye to this and concentrated on discussing the battle that would take place soon, until an archbishop of the Sanctuary of Thoughts came to bless them and personally led the team to the bottom of the hill. There were many onlookers on the roadside. Renly thought he would be criticized, but he attracted cheers and encouragement. A big man with a rough face shouted at him in the crowd, a girl in a headscarf threw flowers for him when she passed by, and many people in the crowd called his particularly simple name. I don't know what this matter has fermented into in one night, but it is obvious that the people in King's Landing and the church have completely different ideas. After you get off the horse, you will die. A low voice came from the side. Turning around, the middle-aged Knight Murray with a square chin was staring at him seriously with his brown eyes. So you must ensure that you can knock the enemy off the horse without any accidents during the charge, so that you can survive this trial. Fortunately, you have invented a good thing for yourself, which can increase your chances of winning. Before Renly said anything, someone on the other side interrupted with a smile, "Good sir, don't look down on our lemon sir so much." The speaker was the training officer Knight Owen. He has great physical strength and excellent recovery ability. His endurance is better than any of us. Don't underestimate him. Sir Lemon is also very good at drinking. One of the twins on the other side interrupted and said, "If the trial method is this, the enemy will definitely lose everything." "Shut up, Amon, why are you still joking at this time?" The other twin scolded. "Damn it, Amon, at this time, you are still framing me." The one who spoke first stared at his brother in surprise. "I am Almon." The two brown-haired twins were insulting each other, and the atmosphere gradually became lively. Even Captain Nancy, who was worried, smiled when he heard the noise behind him, but Knight Murray beside him still had a serious face. "I don't think the enemy can give you time to recover after the battle begins," he still warned Renly. "So what they say doesn't matter at all. Lemon, you have to remember this. You can't dismount. Even if you can deal with the enemy charging you, you can't dismount, wander around and fight against the enemy with a spear or a sword. It's hard to win." His tone was old-fashioned, but he could clearly feel the worry in this man's heart. Renly nodded seriously when he heard this. "Thank you, Sir Maury." His thanks are genuine. In this era, from a picked-up civilian farmer to a knight, and then to the son of a warrior, it was certainly because of what Knight Llewellyn did before his death, but without the careful care of the person in front of him, he would not have been able to do so smoothly. He has been freeloading in the church. Although these help were inconspicuous and the other party never mentioned them, they were crucial and Renly always saw them. "Sir Llewellyn and I are old friends. I should take good care of his descendants," Knight Maury said, patting Renly's arm. "The gods will bless you, Lemon." After saying that, he kicked his spurs and started talking again next to Captain Nancy in front. At this time, the team had reached beyond the range of Rennes Hills. An archbishop in brown robes was walking at the front with a scepter. 7 knights followed behind them on horseback. There were many other sons of warriors following around, and further out, it was a group of monks and nuns. There were countless members of the Poor People's Assembly and even ordinary people who followed, so the team was huge and very eye-catching once it appeared. Even more than that, the entire King's Landing was in a state of turmoil at this time. Looking from the sky, you can see countless densely packed figures appearing from all over the city, and then spontaneously forming ant-like rushing teams, walking through the crowded or loose roads. Among them, they rushed towards the Lion's Gate, the King's Gate and the Riverside Gate. Among the 7 gates of King's Landing, the competition ground was on the outskirts of the city, and these 3 gates were the closest. An ordinary trial by combat would naturally not cause such a grand spectacle, but the trial of the 7 sons was rare in a century, not to mention the confrontation between the church and the Targaryen family. It was the first time in history, and no one wanted to miss it. However, this relatively orderly movement suddenly became very chaotic after a loud and vast roar. People hurriedly looked up at the sky, or pushed and ran towards the buildings on both sides. Some of them had just gone out. He decisively returned to the house and decided not to join in the fun. A single dragon roar sent everyone into chaos. The 7 sons of warriors who participated in the trial were shocked and confused by this, and even paused the team's progress. However, the roar only lasted for a while. They continued on their way until they passed through the gates of King's Landing and arrived at the competition venue outside the city. No accidents occurred. All he saw were 7 enemies in different attires. Chapter 111. The competition venue is close to the King's Gate in King's Landing. It is a vast grassland. On both sides of the grassland are auditoriums isolated by fences. Now a large number of people are swarming out of the cocky city shrouded in morning mist not far away. Walking towards the auditorium, there were also many people already sitting there. The 2 referees for this combat trial were sitting in the stands in the center of the auditorium. One was the brown-robed Archbishop of the Temple of Thought, and the other was an old lady who looked to be in her 60s, wearing a uniform. Wearing a dark black satin robe, he has a rigid face, slender eyebrows, and wrinkles on his face, but his waist is straight and full of fierce temperament. Renly, who was standing at the south end of the meadow, had not seen her, but he guessed that she must be the Conqueror's great queen, the current Queen Mother Visenya. He felt strange that this old man was so old, but he paid more attention to the 7 people confronting them a few hundred yards across the pasture. At this time, on his left was Knight Moray in silver-plated armor, and on his right was one of the brown-haired twins. Like Renly, they all wore original linen robes with crystal swords embroidered on the outside of the standard armor. Some monks, the dressed attendants, were checking for them whether the buckles of the armor were tightly fastened, and no detail was missed. The same is true for those on the opposite side at this time, but their armors and helmets have different shapes, some are simple, some are fancy, some are enameled to look bright and dazzling, and some are only steel-colored, quietly in the morning light, flashing icy luster. Among them, Renly paid special attention to 2 people. One of them was facing him, a tall, middle-aged man with brown hair. He was wearing a gorgeous set of brown armor, and outside the armor, he was wearing more fancy clothes. The blouse has a diagonally divided orange and black base embroidered with a black and orange castle that looks like a burning castle. As expected, this is the enemy he needs to face next. The distance is not close, and when he looks at it carefully, he can't see anything special, but judging from the heraldic pattern, Renly can confirm the opponent's origin. The current ruler of Harrenhal in the Riverlands, a member of House Harroway. This is a lord family that has long since died out in his time, but currently it is at the height of its prominence, or is about to take off because the second woman Maegor married was from this family. Different from the rules of the tournament, the trial of the Seven Sons requires knights to charge head-on with lances, rather than engage in side attacks with a railing to protect them. There is no room for relaxation. The level of cruelty and casualty rate are naturally not comparable to ordinary competitions. The opponent's physique seemed to be comparable to his own, which made Renly wary. In addition, he paid special attention to another tall man wearing pitch-black armor, with a helmet and shoulder armor decorated with dragon heads. He is covered with a black-bottomed red dragon knee-length robe, and the long sword he holds in both hands is dim in color but has a special edge. He is talking to the people next to him, and his eyes glance over from time to time, but he seems not to know much about these people in the church. Care. He is Maegor Targaryen, the third king to sit on the Iron Throne, the future most famous tyrant of the Targaryen dynasty. However, Renly did not observe for long before he was blocked from sight. He saw Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the warrior sons, stepping in front of the knights, and then said to them, "The next battle is crucial. Every day everyone must go all out to live or die. I don't need to worry about the others. You are all already qualified knights, only you, Lemon," he said, looking at Renly. His eyes were still annoyed, but there was also a hint of encouragement. "It's not that you have no chance of winning. The lance charge mainly relies on riding skills, and your riding skills are not bad. What you provide makes up for one of your shortcomings. The only thing you lack is experience. So you need to pay attention after you go on the field. The key is concentration, focus on all the enemy's movements, and react faster than the enemy. Only in this way can you give full play to your advantages." Insiders of the church have always believed that it is very likely that Renly died here, because he had only become a knight not long ago, and before that he was a simple boy born into a commoner. Although he had done something amazing, but that has basically nothing to do with what the trial requires. No matter how you look at it, in this kind of specialized knight competition, it is impossible for him to compare with those senior knights. In fact, if possible, they would have asked Renly to give up his position. After all, this matter is very important to the church and there cannot be any mistakes. It's a pity that someone's preemptive move left them with no choice but to hold their noses and admit the matter. In a sense, this kind of behavior is tantamount to a bully getting on board. It's no wonder that many senior leaders in the church are dissatisfied with Renly. The same was true for the leader Nancy before, but now he stared at him extremely seriously and said, "You're the enemy is Cole Holloway. He is a well-known knight, but has an arrogant temper. And your information is easy to find, so he may have underestimated you. This may be your opportunity, Lemon, seize it. With it, you can win." At this time, the referee in the central stand called representatives from both sides to come forward, so Captain Nancy patted him on the shoulder and finally said, "If we can survive this trial, then I hope to have a good talk with you." After saying that, he got on his horse and rode towards that direction with Raymond, the King's Guard, and the leader of the other side, Maegor, did the same. They were going for a final meeting, which also meant that the competition was about to begin soon. The atmosphere became more solemn as a result. Renly felt that it was unlucky for the captain to raise the flag randomly. Someone around him seemed to think so too, so he asked, "Lemon, are you nervous?" The person asking the question was one of the brown-haired twins, who was looking at him seriously. "A bit," Renly said honestly. "It seems like you can't guess who I am." The other party said with some disappointment. "I was thinking of asking you one more time before I die, but forget it now, nervous people will become stupid. You are Amon." Renly rolled his eyes, and seeing the other person's face showing surprise, he said, "Because Amon has bad breath, Almon does not." The other party was so choked by these words that he even lowered his head and covered his mouth with his hand suspiciously before sniffing. The people around him looked at the worried faces and couldn't help but feel happy. The solemn atmosphere also relaxed a lot, but he still couldn't completely get rid of the influence caused by the environment. Heavy. At this time, not only the auditoriums on both sides, but also the open space to the north and south of the competition venue had been occupied. The densely packed crowd seemed to be tens of thousands. Although no one took the initiative to make a sound, countless trivial sounds gathered together, making it still very noisy. There were too many people here, and he couldn't see anything outside. Looking around, Renly spotted two familiar figures in the stands where the clergy were, which made him frown unconsciously, but at this time, the competition was about to begin. He didn't want to pay much attention to these two people who came over rashly despite being asked to stay in the city. After Captain Nancy and the King's Guard returned, everyone got on their horses one after another. The attendants who served them hurriedly handed over their shields and spears. Although Renly did not bring his attendants, there were still monks who came to help, riding under him. The black war horse has also been wearing a horse headgear, breastplate and mail blanket. So from the outside, he was already looking majestic on horseback like the others in the same row. Remember the plan we agreed on. After giving the final instructions, Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the Sons of Warriors, fastened her steel helmet tightly, held the 12-foot-long training spear in her hand, and rode on the horse, with her back slightly bent and her eyes fixed on the opposite side. The same goes for everyone else, including the enemy. As the two sides silently faced each other across the competition field, an invisible confrontation seemed to have begun. When the horn sounded, 7 horses began to trot towards the opposite side. He leaned over and bent over, his body rising and falling in line with the galloping posture of the war horse. Renly held the lance tightly in his hand. The whistling wind gradually began to rise around him. The sound of the collision of plate armor and mail armor was slightly audible. His heart was beating more and more violently like a beating. Drums were playing, but other than that, he ignored other sounds in the surrounding environment, such as crowds shouting, rivers rushing, birds fluttering, horses roaring. The running rhythm of the warhorse beneath him became more and more rapid, and the initial trot gradually turned into a fierce gallop. The rumble of the horse's hooves hitting the ground combined with the tremor of the horse's body was like an earthquake. Due to the limitations of his helmet, Renly could not see his companions on both sides except directly in front of him. He could only see the knights' spears wrapped in colorful stripes pointing toward the front. But then he no longer paid attention to what he saw out of the corner of his eye. His eyes were focused on the opposite side. The enemy wearing gorgeous armor and charging at high speed became taller and more obvious. The burly physique, the dark yellow robe that flutters in the wind, the castle crest on the shield, and the lance that is raised diagonally and does not look sharp at the front. The most important lance. Renly on horseback suddenly woke up. The opponent was using the same training spear as they were. It was also a 12-foot-long training spear, not an 8-foot real war spear with a sharp tip. But all this was discovered too late, because the moment of confrontation has arrived. Looking down from the sky, one could see 7 fully armed knights from each side rushing towards each other on the grassland like 14 arrows. Each lance suddenly aimed at their respective targets at the right moment. Immediately afterwards, at that moment, several loud noises suddenly sounded due to the extremely high-speed collision, horses neighed, people screamed, and there was an instant uproar from the direction of the surrounding crowd. All kinds of sounds seemed to be born suddenly at the same moment, just like the long simmering judgment suddenly erupted, with death and blood splashing, exclamations and roars. At the last moment, Renly tried his best to direct his horse to hit the opponent's horse instead of avoiding it sideways. The lance in his hand ignored the enemy's precise defensive shield and instantly hit the left chest of the opponent's rather fancy robe. The gun ring and gun frame cooperated with the charging speed of the warhorse and the heavy collision. As the two spears suddenly shattered and sawdust flew, the tall figure on the horse on the opposite side was immediately lifted up and spun away by the huge impact. Then he fell down on the grass in the distance, making a violent friction sound of armor, his arms moved slightly, and then he lay there motionless as if he had lost all strength. But that doesn't mean Renly wins. The force of the shock caused by the collision of two fast-moving horses made him dizzy. Likewise, he was unable to avoid the enemy's attack, and his chest armor was even dented. Fortunately, the enemy did not expect him to be so crazy, so the attack angle did not fully exert the power of the charge. However, it also made Renly's upper body lean back for a while before he reluctantly came back, feeling the blood in his body gushing out. The pain was severe, as if the whole heart was about to be broken by the impact. What was even more unlucky was that a piece of splintered wood from the lance shaft was deeply inserted into the left eye of the horse beneath him, causing the horse to stagger and stumble, eventually falling to the ground with a howl and a roar. The knight on horseback fell off his horse in one fell swoop. Chapter 112. A lot of things happened in an instant. The enemy's strategy was obviously to use a longer training spear to knock the warrior sons off their horses, but they met the same response. So much so that the situation did not develop as anyone imagined. At the moment of the confrontation, the leader of the warrior sons, Captain Nancy, avoided the charge of the enemy opposite him, and at the same time used the lance in his hand to knock the opponent off his horse. However, Knight Owen beside him was caught off guard by the attack guided by the warhorse under him because the enemy suddenly aimed at the eyes of the horse under him. Then he fell to the ground with the warhorse, and suddenly screamed, and his legs were obviously broken by the heavy warhorse. The enemy wanted to take advantage of the situation to kill him directly, but Knight Murray, who had successfully dealt with the opponent on the side, suddenly rushed over and confronted him head-on. One of the twin warrior sons successfully stabbed the lance at the opponent's neck armor. The huge impact seemed to directly break the opponent's neck, and he easily blocked the enemy's attack with a shield. Unfortunately, his brother who joked with Renly before the battle was not so lucky. His lance hit the enemy's shield, and he was also thrown off his horse. After rolling and struggling for a long time, he started a foot battle with the enemy who also fell off his horse. In the trial, the most important battle was between the challenger and the challenged. Maegor, wearing carved black dragon armor, faced Raymond, a king's guard wearing a white robe. Although Baratheon was very skilled, Maegor, who had been trained since childhood and had special blood, had even more amazing strength and skills. Raymond's lance not only did not hit the enemy, but he was knocked off his horse by a blow. Although he did not die, he fell to the ground panting, as if he had broken several ribs. So the victorious Captain Nancy on the other side could only rush forward to deal with it. After a round of battle, the situation caught everyone off guard. The only active people on the side of the warrior sons were Captain Nancy, Knight Murray, and the twins. The enemy side only had 3 left. Seemingly in an advantageous position, Nancy, the leader of the warrior sons, who was fighting with Maegor, was no match for the brutal and tyrannical Targaryen. As soon as the battle began, they were forced to retreat step by step, so that the twin who easily defeated the enemy had to join in and start a 2-on-1 battle to barely hold on. One of the remaining 2, Knight Murray, tied with the enemy, while the last twin was at a disadvantage. It seemed that the previous fall from the horse had broken his sword hand, so that he was now very passive and looked like he might lose at any time. Fighting skills are important, but sometimes luck is also crucial. Although the existence of the lance rack strengthened the power of the charge and the mastery of the lance, this enhanced advantage was reduced to the lowest point when the enemy used weapons of the same length. It is not clear whether the enemy was lucky to see the opportunity first, or someone leaked the news. The vast grassland under the sunlight was full of people on both sides. Everyone in the audience was closely watching everything in the arena, and exclaimed from time to time. In the crowd, a bald boy was struggling to pull a thin figure to prevent her from leaving the seat. There were several other nuns helping him. The noise was not small, but it did not attract the attention of anyone watching the trial. The sound of steel clashing continued to sound from the grass. The 3 battles were fierce as soon as they started. The Knight Owen, who had broken his leg, took off his helmet and threw it aside, revealing a sticky blonde hair. He struggled to crawl to the side of the key figure, the king's guard, who fell to the ground and gasped, and protected him behind him. He looked at the remaining companion who fell off the horse but seemed not to be dead not far away, and his eyes were full of expectation, but then turned into disappointment. After the advantage of the lance was weakened, the new knight named Lemon was still able to get rid of the opponent at the last moment. The result was actually quite beyond his expectations, but the blonde figure who fell off the horse seemed unable to get up. He lay on the ground with his chest rising and falling, but he did not make any other movements, as if his ribs were broken. This made Knight Owen feel depressed, and he could not help but glance at the brown-haired twin companions who were at a disadvantage in the field. "I told you to joke around before the start, you guys are dead, now you are getting retribution," the panting Knight Owen murmured, with a bitter look on his face, but then he suddenly found that the arm of the tall companion lying on the ground not far away suddenly moved a little, which made him slightly stunned. After glancing at the current battle situation, he gritted his teeth and picked up a little mud from the ground and made a ball, and then threw it at the tall companion on the edge of the arena. The helmet, which became stuffy due to panting, blocked most of the noise coming from outside, but he could still hear bursts of noise coming from nearby. It seemed that there were onlookers cheering him up, constantly urging him to stand up, and there were also faint curses, as if the enemy supporters were angry with him. However, facing all this, Renly felt quite bewildered, his mind was dazed, and he felt as if he was in a dream and couldn't understand his own situation. At this moment, all he could do was breathe and stare blankly. The impact of the two horses combined with the attack of the enemy on him made him unable to react when the warhorse collapsed. After falling to the ground dully, he faced another impact, which was even more hurt. Combined with all these situations, he felt dizzy at this time, his heart beat obviously abnormally, and his whole thinking was strangely trapped in a state similar to dream, or half asleep and half awake. It was unknown how long he had been in this state, when a series of knocking noises suddenly reached his ears, making him feel as if someone was knocking on the door. Renly wanted to get up and open the door, but his dream instinct kept him where he was, as if this was the right thing to do. So he quietly listened to the knocking sound and was unmoved. In a daze, he thought of a very classic question: who am I? The knocking sound continued, and the question remained in his heart. He wanted to stop thinking about it, but he felt that this question seemed very important. It was just that the ubiquitous haze and dream around him had always enveloped him, making Renly's thinking very slow and confused at this time, and he could not figure out the root of the problem. It was not until a feeling of falling into an ice cellar suddenly emerged from his body, and until the color of his eyes hidden in the steel helmet quietly changed from emerald green to ice blue, that the blonde knight felt his rapidly beating heart ease. At the same time, as soon as this feeling was born, the confusion in his head was suddenly blown away like fog encountering a strong wind, which made him shudder and sit up directly. Because of the helmet on his head, his vision was severely blocked, but it did not affect Renly's clear view of the current situation. What he saw was a vast dark green grassland, where the messy horses and the battle were fierce, and in the densely packed audience seats opposite the grassland, countless people seemed to be shouting something at him, and there were also waves of deafening noises behind him like a tide. Turning his head, he saw an old man leaning out of the guardrail, and now he was yelling at him with a flushed face. The spit splashing out was clearly visible, mixed with the expectation of Renly, and splashed all over his silver-plated breastplate that was stained with mud and had a punctured robe. "Stand up, Sir Lemon, stand up quickly. Go and defeat those monsters, they need you, yes, we all need you. You have a really loud voice." Looking down at his chest, Renly murmured in response. "What is the Sir?" The other party shouted. The surrounding voices were too loud, and normal words could not be heard at all. Without responding, Renly had already climbed up at this time. After a glance around, he suddenly found that both sides of the battle had already started fighting on foot, and no one was riding horses to meet the enemy. This made him move his heart, and temporarily gave up a certain battle plan he had thought about before the battle, and instead quickly ran towards a companion horse that was intact not far away. As he ran, the cool feeling in his body gradually spread, and the stabbing pain in his heart and the pain caused by falling off the horse gradually eased, as if he had applied ice cubes after being burned, which made him feel inexplicably comfortable. This seemed to be the work of the mutated blood power in his body. Renly could not figure out why this power could still work when they were not in the same body. He did not want to think about this long-standing problem now. He approached the warhorse and turned over without hesitation. The dense crowd around cheered fiercely when they saw this, and they were obviously excited about this resurrection drama and the changes that would be made after the blonde knight joined the battle. At this moment, inexplicably, there seemed to be an invisible force rushing over, so that the knowledge about knights such as riding horses, lances, swords and shields quickly flashed through the blonde knight's mind on horseback. At the same time, his heart, which had originally calmed down a lot, started beating rapidly again. He had not yet fully recovered from the impact of the previous charge, so when faced with this sudden change in speed, waves of stabbing pain unconsciously emerged and spread from his chest. But then, a piece of information that had not been heard for a long time suddenly appeared. You have obtained the profession, Knight. Chapter 113. You have gained a profession, Knight. You have obtained the professional characteristic, the spirit of singing. The two messages in succession made Renly look a little dazed, but then his thinking suddenly became clear and focused. It was similar to the feeling when he woke up from the crack before, but it was more obvious. At the same time, his whole body seemed to be full of energy. Strength. When looking at the battlefield, a warlike mood made him a little ready to move. This situation may be due to the newly acquired professional characteristics, but the current situation leaves little room for hesitation and thinking, and there is no explanatory text, so Renly ignores it for the time being. The horse under him neighed and kicked as it was being ridden. It was very resistant to Renly, a person who was neither unfamiliar nor familiar. The blonde knight sitting on top of it comforted him for a while before finally calming down. The tall knight wearing silver-plated armor reached out and picked up a weapon hanging on the side of the horse. It was a ferocious-looking mace, with a cloth strip wrapped around the hammer's handle, and the sharp-edged hammer head glowed with cold and sharp edges in the sunlight. After taking a glance at the current battle situation, the knight on horseback clamped his horse's belly and trotted towards the enemy whose robe was embroidered with black bats, who was fighting on foot with the original owner of the horse. The competition ground occupies a large area. Accompanied by the shouts of countless spectators, the tall brown warhorse carrying the Iron Knight trotted and then galloped. Such obvious sound of horse hooves naturally could not escape the ears of the enemy with the bat emblem, so his movements changed, and he seemed to be looking for cover. But at this moment, Anman, one of the brown-haired twins who also noticed that his companion was rushing towards him, suddenly wrapped him around desperately. Although the sword in his left hand was clumsy, it was very fast when he swung it, completely ignoring the armor exposed by his open door. There was a flaw, so much so that within a few breaths, he had a new wound on his body. The enemy was dragged in place because of this. When he leaned down and counterattacked, the Iron Knight charged forward, and a mace slammed into his face with the sound of wind. The enemy with the bat emblem therefore rolled on the spot without hesitation, preparing to avoid the enemy's charge, but the knight on horseback seemed to have expected this. Just as the enemy rolled on the ground, the charging knight held the reins tightly. Suddenly leaned over and turned slightly to the side of the horse, and swung the heavy mace in his right hand violently towards the head of the unprepared enemy on the ground. The heavy hammer head smashed through the air and hit the target. Without any surprise, a strong muffled sound was heard. The knight with a black bat embroidered on his robe was directly hit by the sudden close attack. His upper body bounced to the ground, causing a burst of armor friction. There was a roar, a faint sound of cracking bones, and blood immediately overflowed from under the obviously dented helmet. Renly was not good at using weapons, but his riding skills were good. At the same time, the special feeling that filled his body made him not only focused in battle, but also seemed to have a lot more strength and courage, even risking such a look. It looks majestic but is actually quite dangerous. The action was dangerous, but the effect was outstanding and quite enjoyable to watch. The enemy who fell to the ground twitched a few times and then became motionless. He had obviously been killed by the hammer. The surrounding audience watched in amazement, and many people even shouted his name made Renly feel like he was in a better state. The brown-haired twin Amon, who was wearing armor and staggering, laughed at him, then collapsed to the ground with a thump, his joints bleeding all over his body, and he was obviously exhausted, but he still shouted hoarsely to Renly, "Go quickly support, Lemon, don't worry about me. This one seems to be in good spirits, but I don't know how injured he is." The knight on the horse had no time to think about this. After nodding to the opponent, he turned his horse and ran towards the other enemies with the mace. At this time, Nancy, the leader of the group, and Almon, the other twin, were working together to deal with the Tallmagger, who was wearing black dragon armor, while Knight Moray was fighting back and forth with a knight with a yellow and black checkered coat of arms on his shield. But even though focusing on the battle, what happened over there still did not escape their eyes, so the two remaining enemies were frightened, but their own morale was boosted. The galloping warhorse charged fiercely towards Knight Murray, and the sharp mace was swung at the enemy's head as before, but was dexterously avoided by the enemy. However, because of his distraction, he let Knight Murray saw an opportunity and pierced the opponent's side and armpit with a sword, causing a splash of blood. However, the enemy also evaded the moment he was attacked, so the sword could only be regarded as a minor injury. They continued to fight, but the injured enemy was obviously at a disadvantage. Renly did not join in hastily, but just rode his horse at a trot around the two fighting sites, swinging the mace in his hand from time to time. The whole person seemed ready to move. From time to time, he would charge towards the enemy more and more, but it was just a fake move of firing a shot. But once, the illusion turned into reality, and he really launched a second charge. So the mace rushed forward fiercely with the strong wind. The enemy barely managed to avoid his head, but was hit hard on the shoulder. With the sound of broken bones, he screamed and staggered back, covering his shoulders. Murray saw the opportunity. The knight quickly launched a counterattack, and then directly knocked him to the ground. Finally, he opened his visor and thrust the sword in his hand fiercely. After the sudden scream, only Magor was still resisting at the end of this trial. "But there are 4 of us." A round of cheers broke out again. Most of the people standing in the audience seats and outside the railings watched the battle in the field with satisfaction but reluctance. They generally believed that the result of this trial was already determined. The old lady who had been sitting dignified at the trial seat had a gloomy and terrible expression on her face. Obviously, she did not expect this result to appear. However, all this changed completely in the next moment. The victorious knight Murray and Renly rushed to another battlefield, but before they ran to the battle, the change suddenly occurred. After a clash, the sword in the hands of the twin warrior sons named Almone suddenly broke, and the enemy ignored the attack of Captain Nancy on the other side, and stabbed the ancient-shaped longsword in his hand into the eye gap of Almone's helmet when he was caught off guard. After a muffled scream, the warrior son died tragically on the spot. Although the sword of Captain Nancy hit Mugger's head back, it did not seem to make him dizzy. Instead, the tall enemy roared and quickly launched a counterattack. With the violent burst of action, Captain Nancy hurriedly launched a defense, but after a few moves, the weapon in his hand also collapsed into several fragments and scattered all over the ground. In the face of the surging long sword, he could only use the steel wrist guards on both hands to barely resist, without any resistance. However, after forcing him back, Mugger ignored the enemy who had lost the possibility of attacking but turned and ran towards the direction where the king's guard collapsed on the other side, ready to kill the challenger directly to end this ever-changing trial of the Seven Sons. The Black Fire Sword, the inherited sword of the Targaryen family, was once the sword used by Aegon the Conqueror. It is said to be made of Valyrian steel refined by magic. It is sharp and tough, and ordinary weapons are simply incomparable. Chapter 114. The sudden change in the battle situation caught everyone off guard. Facing this, Renly urged his horse to run forward, passing the knight Murray who was also running next to him, and raised his mace horizontally to smash the enemy. However, the enemy dodged it lightly by leaning back and stepping sideways, and at the same time, he instantly raised his sharp long sword and swept it fiercely across the back of the charging horse. The horse's buttocks were not protected by a lock blanket, and the Valyrian steel sword, which was said to be made by magic, was also extremely sharp. The wound was so deep that the bone could be seen. So after a painful neigh, the horse staggered and its hind legs softened and it almost fell to the ground. Renly hurriedly pulled back to prevent the horse from collapsing directly, but it was obvious that it could not continue to charge. However, looking back, because of this delay, Captain Nancy, who was left behind, entangled with Mugger, who was wearing majestic black armor, holding a shield picked up from the ground and a dagger in his hand, and was struggling to defend and wait for an opportunity to counterattack. The only warrior sons who could still fight at this time, apart from Renly, were Captain Nancy and Knight Murray who rushed over behind. The remaining twins were lying not far away, sad and angry at the death of their brother, but the previous battle seemed to have injured his joints and he could not get up, so he could only keep crawling over here. Knight Owen, whose leg was broken by the warhorse, also slumped on the ground, protecting the pale-faced king's guard of his family behind him. Fortunately, the enemy only had one person, Mugger, wearing armor glazed with a red dragon emblem. The others were either lying on the ground in a coma or had died quietly, but no one cared. Knight Murray and Captain Nancy worked together to fight against Mugger. Fighting for a long time in heavy armor seemed to make them full of fatigue, so that their reactions in battle became slower and slower, but the enemy did not seem to encounter this problem, and every move was still fierce. The horses in the pasture were in a mess, and the bodies of the knights in armor were scattered everywhere. The horses under him could no longer fight. After getting off the horses, Renly prepared to get another horse to fight the enemy, but the appearance of one agile and the other slow made him hesitate. Would his charge reach the enemy, or would the enemy take advantage of his companion's slow reaction to contain him? After thinking about it, he gave up the idea of looking for horses, and instead rushed towards the enemy with the mace in his hand. At this time, the battle situation seemed a little precarious. Knight Murray, who hurriedly used his sword to block Mugger's blow, saw Renly running towards him from the corner of his eye and couldn't help but curse. "Are you here to die?" "Yes." While Captain Nancy was on the other side, his shield was hitting Mugger's waist and abdomen, so that he could relax his pressure. Renly ran over with gritted teeth and answered loudly, but his movements were not slow, and his mace hit the enemy's head directly. As a result, Mugger, who seemed to be rooted in the ground and ignored the impact of the shield, had to step back, avoiding this fatal attack and giving up the action of suppressing Knight Murray. The middle-aged knight who was half kneeling on the ground stood up panting, and the enemy did not launch an attack temporarily because of the presence of these three people. He panted and began to concentrate on confronting them. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Renly directly put the mace in his hand into the hands of Captain Nancy beside him. At the same time, under the other party's stunned expression, he took out a blue dagger he carried with him, and used it to cut and remove the concave breastplate straps on his chest and the heavy leg armor buckles on his legs. Finally, he took off the beryl silver helmet on his head that was very obstructive to his vision and threw it away, leaving only the silver mail and loose leather armor and trousers on his body. The enemy was a little surprised by this, and his companions were even more shocked. "Are you crazy?" Knight Murray shouted in a low voice, looking at the young man's anxious appearance of taking off his defense. "It is easy to take off the armor, but it is difficult to put it on. Now that he is in a battle, it is basically impossible for this man to wear armor again. However, without the protection of plate armor, facing the enemy's extremely sharp Valyrian steel sword, the mail and leather armor on his body alone can't defend against any attack, and even facing the enemy's stab, it can't defend against it at all. I'll create an opportunity," Renly answered without waiting for a response. He turned the dagger in his hand and rushed towards the black figure who was staring at them vigilantly. The short distance of a few steps passed in a flash. Facing the unarmed blonde knight, Maegor, who was wearing black armor, felt strange, but he still clenched the long sword in his hand and chopped it without hesitation. The sharp weapon flashed dazzlingly under the sunlight, aiming at Renly's forehead, and the speed was like lightning, as if he would cut off his skull in the next moment. What Renly thought of at this time was the teachings of the brown-haired twins who had died tragically on the training ground. So when the opponent's weapon attacked, the blonde figure who was bent over and rushed forward suddenly pounced on the ground, narrowly dodged the attack and rolled behind the enemy. Then, while the enemy was unable to react, he stabbed back without hesitation with the dagger in his hand. With a sudden muffled scream, Maegor, who was a little slow to react and even failed to dodge completely, was stabbed in the back of his knee. Then his steps became chaotic, and the weapon in his hand was shaken a little when facing the golden-haired figure who was dodging like a donkey. It just barely swept across his back, leaving a scar of cutting the mail, but no blood stains appeared. After rolling on the ground, Renly, who was covered with grass, stood up nimbly, and then grinned at the two-on-one battle that was unfolding again not far away. It's not easy to fight all meat shields. It was obvious that no one would hear his muttered words. Although his sudden change in fighting style was unexpected, the two remaining sons of warriors did not hesitate at all, and directly attacked him when they saw the opportunity. The sound of gold and iron clashing sounded again. 3 figures, 1 black and 2 silver, moved back and forth to attack and defend. On the edge of the battle, there was a tall figure holding a dagger and a slightly tight waist, spinning and pacing to look at the tiger. His forehead was tight with sweat. The few strands of long golden hair she wore seemed to be faintly reflective under the sunlight. There were 3 knights slumped there in the distance on the grass. One had both legs broken and could not move, and the other was bleeding from the gaps in his armor. They were staring at the battle without blinking, with tense expressions. The last one in a white robe was panting and unable to get up, which made a certain bald boy in the audience lament and feel inexplicably embarrassed. But overall, he was quite excited, because he felt that the victory of this battle was basically finalized. So while he was feeling relaxed, the boy Ego noticed something strange around him. There was always a lot of noise around, and everyone in the crowded auditorium was yelling at the changes in the battle situation. Rhea, who was on the left of Ego, was sitting there honestly and showed nothing unusual. After seeing the blonde figure's lively appearance, she stopped being restless. But on the right side of Egg, he suddenly found that the nun who was sitting there had turned into another person. Sister Ada. After seeing his appearance clearly, the boy asked strangely, "When did you come? This nun has been missing for a while, and no one knows where she went." Because of her special status, her disappearance caused a lot of discussion in the Holy Church, but was later covered up by the news of the 7 sons' trial. Originally, the boy had speculated that something unexpected would happen to the nun and she would never come back. But now he suddenly saw her here, and he felt a little strange about it in his heart. It's just that what's strange about Yige is that he can't explain it. Just arrived. After hearing this, the old man wrapped in a snow-white turban lowered his head and smiled at the boy and said, "Let's watch a good show. If it is not on the shelves today, it seems that it will not be on the shelves in the next few days. It may take more than 10 days to be put on the shelves, depending on the website arrangement. In addition, when it was released, I expected to have the same 10 updates as the previous book, but I haven't saved up enough yet, and I don't know if I can achieve it. I will confirm the specific number when I write a testimonial. I haven't been getting better from my cold recently, and my teeth are always going wrong. I'm really not in a good condition." Chapter 115. The noise around the audience was very loud, and it spread all over the place along with the river breeze blowing quietly. Most people's minds were attracted by the battle scene below, but the words of the nun next to him at this moment made the boy temporarily ignore the situation below, and turn to look strange. "You are late, Sister Ada, the good show is almost over," the boy explained. "Not necessarily." The nun responded with a smile, raised her hand and touched the boy's bald head. Under the other's slightly wrinkled nose expression, she whispered, "It's just beginning." The surrounding noise was too loud, and the boy ego didn't hear this sentence, but he felt that the nun seemed a little strange and a little familiar. "We haven't said a few words, why are you touching my head?" Secretly a little disgusted, the boy shook his head instinctively. Originally, he just expressed his dissatisfaction, but found that the nun's hand was easily shaken down by him. Looking up, he found that the nun with black and white hair was staring at the situation in the arena. Following her gaze, Ego suddenly found that she was not looking at the blonde figure that everyone was paying attention to, but the besieged black-armored Magyar. Although the battle was prolonged because of the tight armor they were wearing, the situation in the arena became clearer as time passed. In the dark green lawn arena, the blonde knight holding a dagger had been walking slowly sideways and staring at the three people fighting, but he never took action again. It seemed that except for the unexpected attack at the beginning, he did not find another opportunity to intervene in the battle, and he seemed to be gathering his strength and ready to launch a fatal attack at any time. However, the overall situation did not change because of his observation. The enemy's movements affected by the leg wound were no longer as agile as before, and there was a noticeable sluggishness every time he moved his feet. At the same time, perhaps because he had been concentrating on the battle for too long, or because he was concerned about the existence of the man holding the dagger, the powerful warrior who was quite fierce in the Seven Kingdoms was not as fierce as before when launching an attack. His reaction became slow, his defense became slow, and he was even forced to retreat step by the sons of the two warriors on the opposite side. People thought that he was about to run out of energy and had no strength. This was normal. The armor of the Knights of the Seven Kingdoms was designed not to affect fighting on foot, but it was not very light. Unfortunately, the remaining two people on the church side were also exhausted physically and mentally. There were many opportunities that came with the enemy's physical exhaustion, but they did not seize them at all. Although the enemy was constantly retreating, it seemed that the battle could not be resolved for a while. If you don't consider the blonde knight who still looked lively on the side. Although it seemed that his actions at this time were obviously different from the knight's fighting style, except for some noble royalists, most of the people were very excited and even urged him to go forward and stab Magyar to death and not drag it on. Obviously, the blonde figure ignored the roars coming from all around, because he had been circling the battlefield without haste, but perhaps he was already angry because he was suppressed, or the noise was too noisy. Magyar, who had retreated to the fence of the arena, suddenly endured an attack from Knight Murray's armpit, just to chop the sword in his hand on Captain Nancy's forehead. His action was successful, but he did not kill Captain Nancy with one blow, but only knocked him a little dizzy, and even staggered and his legs were weak. Seeing this, Knight Murray turned around to defend in front of him, but at this moment Magyar ignored him and rushed towards Renly not far away, and the muffled sound under the helmet seemed particularly angry. "Despicable guy, I'm going to skin you alive." The heavy footsteps accompanied by the muffled roar caused boos or cheers. Although his leg was injured and his armpit was bleeding, he seemed to completely ignore the pain and various injuries on his body at this moment, and his speed of running quickly did not seem slow. However, Renly took off his armor for the purpose of gaining dexterity and agility. When he saw the other party rushing towards him, he turned around and ran without hesitation, causing the other party to roar continuously, but he didn't even touch the corner of the enemy's clothes. This behavior naturally undermined the chivalry. Renly didn't care about what the onlookers said about him, but he found that when he retreated, the special blessing power in his body, which was much weaker than the initial one, weakened again, and even became imperceptible. This gave him a basic understanding of the characteristics given by the knight profession, but this was naturally not a good time to think about it. Seeing that he could not be caught for a while, the angry enemy turned to rush towards the distant king's guard, but at this time, the two warrior sons who were left behind came up again. Captain Nancy, who was hit on the head, did not seem to be in any serious trouble. Although the weapon in his hand had been damaged, he held a round shield with a border for defense, while Knight Murray was mainly responsible for attacking. So the two exhausted people, one holding a shield and the other swinging a sword, continued to fight with the enemy, who seemed to be full of energy but whose movements were becoming increasingly slow. The sound of metal clashing continued, and it kept ringing like a special performance. Not long after, Renly, who was closely watching the battle, saw an opportunity and rushed over in an instant, which disrupted the rhythm. The enemy had strong defense, and it was not convenient for him to follow the previous behavior of rolling and stabbing his legs with the presence of two warrior sons on the opposite side, so Renly aimed the dagger in his hand at his armpit. But before he could succeed in his attack, the enemy, who had his back to him, ignored the long sword swung by Knight Murray in front of him, turned around and kicked the golden-haired figure, accompanied by a dull roar, as if he was extremely angry about Renly's existence. The dagger in his hand could not resist this attack. At the critical moment, Renly did not retreat but advanced, holding the opponent's thigh before the kick came, and then pushed hard regardless of the impact brought by the huge force, directly knocking the man backward to the ground. Knight Murray's sword deviated and hit the enemy's shoulder, while Captain Nancy, who was holding a shield on the side, pounced at the same time, holding the enemy's right hand, holding the Valyrian steel sword tightly with both hands. This seemed to happen in succession in an instant. The few people who were entangled before suddenly rolled into a ball, one hugged his legs, one pressed his arms, and the last one saw the opportunity and leaned on the sword in his hand to stab the enemy's neck lying on the ground, but the enemy dodged it with a tilt of his head. At the same time, the enemy's left hand, which was wearing a steel glove and not bound, suddenly raised and grasped the long sword that was deeply inserted into the ground, then roared and pulled it hard. After a creaking sound, accompanied by the opposing force of Knight Murray holding the hilt, the sword was actually broken in an instant. Obviously, the long sword that had been attacked by the Valyrian steel sword many times was already shaky, and this violent pull was just the last straw, but Knight Murray holding the sword was still caught off guard, so much so that he stumbled and collapsed on the enemy with a bang. The situation suddenly became three people holding down one. Renly, who was holding his leg, was then kicked hard in the ribs by the opponent's other foot. The top of the steel-cast combat boot was pointed, and the impact brought about Renly felt a sharp pain, but this attack did not make him let go, but took the opportunity to hold the opponent's other leg tightly. The enemy roared in a muffled voice, and the strange power that suddenly emerged in his right hand almost made the exhausted Captain Nancy unable to suppress it. Seeing this, Knight Murray, who had climbed up, hurriedly lifted the visor of Meg's helmet, then clenched his fist with one hand and punched the opponent's handsome and unruly young face fiercely, while the other hand resisted the harassment of the opponent's left hand struggling. The fist came down, and the sound of the bridge of the nose was cracked, accompanied by the opponent's muffled screams, which also made the situation of falling to the ground and struggling more intense. The loud shouts around were like a wave, and it seemed that the whole world became a mess. Knight Murray's second punch was blocked by the opponent's raised left hand, but it was just passive defense. Then the third punch, the fourth punch. Although the middle-aged knight was exhausted, he gritted his teeth and burst out a fierce force at this moment. The sound of steel and flesh colliding continued, and teeth broke and dull screams were born continuously. The surviving Knight Owen on the other side of the field was watching all this with excitement, but he didn't notice that the white-robed figure behind him had quietly stopped breathing. Almon, one of the twins who was lying on the ground next to him, was crawling towards that side, as if he wanted to go over and stab his brother a few more times, but he was moving slowly because of his injuries. Queen Visanina, who was in the audience on one side of the grassland, had stood up and yelled something at this side, but her voice was drowned in the huge sound waves and was not noticeable at all. "It's time." Sister Ada, who was drowned in the audience, glanced at the figure who stood up and yelled excitedly on the judgment seat opposite, and a trace of pain flashed in her eyes, but more of it was pleasure. The boy vaguely heard the person next to him say this, but thought it was about the victory result, so he didn't care. Instead, he was still immersed in the joy of the knight beating his usurper uncle on the field, jumping and cheering like the people around him. The mute girl beside him sat there obediently. Compared with the surroundings, she seemed to be the quietest one. Her molten golden eyes kept looking at the golden-haired existence holding the enemy's legs in the field, with a thoughtful expression. But then she seemed to feel something, her face was stunned, and then she lied, hesitating and saying some random syllables to the boy beside her, but she was completely drowned in the noise around her, so she stood up and ran along the aisle to the field. The boy didn't hear the other person's voice, but saw her back standing up and running out, so he raised his hand and tried to pull her, but he didn't pull her at once. Then he stood up and prepared to chase her, but a strong hand grabbed him instead. "Don't worry about her, she is not afraid of fire." A hoarse voice sounded. What are you talking about? The boy looked at the very strange Sister Ada beside him in confusion. The other party didn't answer, but smiled and raised her slightly wrinkled hand and touched the boy's bald head. What do you think this rebellious kingdom needs, kid? It needs a wise king. The boy answered smoothly, then struggled hard, but found that his strength was not as great as the old man next to him. No. Sister Ada ignored the boy's impatient expression and said to him seriously, it's blood and fire. Chapter 116. Blood and Fire. Blood and fire is the motto of the Targaryen family. Although the boy could not hear it clearly due to the surrounding noise, he was still very familiar with the pronunciation of this sentence, so he was stunned after hearing it. We conquered Westeros with 3 dragons, now we have 13. Sister Ada looked down at the boy with a strange expression. There was an unforgettable hatred brewing in her slightly turbid blue eyes, as well as the joy that the great revenge was about to be avenged. In the future we may have 23, 33, or even 133. She was more talking to herself than to the boy. Your brother was assassinated and your father was forced back to Dragonstone. The whole kingdom was laughing at him. I could bear it and didn't care about it. After all, Aenys was too soft-tempered. But Visenya, how could Visenya to be so cruel? She will pay the price, yes, everyone will pay the price, and today is just a starting point. What are you talking about? The boy stared at the other person in shock and asked, with a vague premonition of something bad. I say, the show is about to begin, the nun replied softly. Successfully completed the 7 Sons trial mission. You have gained the characteristic son of a warrior. As the sweat dripped and the gasps intensified, Knight Murray's fists hit the struggling black-armored enemy under him again and again. The steel fingers with lobster gauntlets were covered with blood, but even if the enemy's face was beaten, Fuzzy was not completely dead, but was struggling very fiercely. However, this intensity did not last long before he slumped and lost all his strength. Knight Murray punched a few more times uneasily, and finally collapsed to the ground and laughed. Captain Nancy, who had been suppressing the enemy's right hand, also fell down. There he was smiling foolishly, sweat dripping from his forehead to the grass next to him. The enemy's last struggle was very powerful, and it was unclear why it was so powerful. Even Renly, who was restraining his legs, was exhausted at this moment. After seeing that the enemy was no longer moving, he lay down and hugged his legs and completely relaxed. He came down, turned over, and lay on his back on the grass, breathing heavily. The sunshine in the sky was so intense that it was dazzling, and the surrounding environment was filled with countless noises. They were the shouts of the onlookers from all directions. They were extremely excited about everything on the field. The difference was that some were angry and some were excited. Soldiers rushed toward the entrance area of the competition venue, but they were blocked by a group of warrior sons. From the corner of the eye, they could be seen clashing. On the judgment seat in the other direction, the old brown-robed Archbishop of the Church of Thought was sitting on the ground, while the old lady beside him stood up and shouted something to him, but she was too far away to hear it. Unclear words. She might have given up, otherwise no information would have emerged, but Renly didn't think too much about the newly born information and the meaning behind it. At the moment, he was tired and panting, and there was still a constant sound coming from his heart. Painful, the brain instinctively wants to empty out, want to lie down and rest, and is unwilling to think about anything else. Unfortunately, his rest was interrupted after a while. When his light ice blue eyes, which had quietly replaced the original color, were staring blankly at the sky, there was a sudden sound of footsteps beside him, and then he felt someone kneeling down. He moved to his side, and just as he was about to turn his head to look, a shaking force made his chest suddenly feel tight, and then he coughed involuntarily. Why are you here? Renly originally wanted to curse, but when he turned his head, he found that the person shaking him was Lya, a girl wearing a white robe, so his words turned into a surprised question. It's a pity that this person obviously didn't have the ability to answer his question, and now he was pulling his arm with an anxious look on his face, trying to get him to stand up. This expression made Renly startled. Then without any hesitation, regardless of his lack of strength, he gritted his teeth and stood up with the help of the other party. Then he was just about to call his 2 collapsed companions 1 meter away to stand up. The cool feeling that blocked out the sun suddenly came, and a shadow of a beast was born on the ground under his feet, and it grew rapidly. Renly's heart skipped a beat, and he looked up unconsciously. He saw a dragon. A giant dragon with dark yellow scales and wings spread out as if covering the sky and the sun. This dragon swooped down from the sky behind the competition arena, and appeared silently. By the time people discovered it, it had already reached the sky above the competition arena. The whole environment suddenly became silent, and then panicked and screamed like a tsunami. Pass a wave! Chaos suddenly emerged. Women, children, old people, monks, and even bishops, everyone rushed to the exit of the auditorium in a panic. Some civilians standing on both sides of the audience turned around and ran away without hesitation. From a bird's eye view, the entire competition ground is like a high-rise building that was suddenly exploded. Countless gravel and dust collapsed and poured out in all directions, causing ripples. In the green grass-covered competition ground, the two warrior sons who were lying down had already hurriedly got up without Renly's reminder, and the smiles on their faces had long since disappeared. Captain Nancy yelled while crawling, "You use dragons when you lose the contest? The Targaryens deserve to go to the seven hells, you are a bunch of bastards." He didn't care about the image of the group leader at all. He looked like a little gangster who was not afraid of anything, but his expression was slightly desperate. However, after he got up, he did not run away directly, but headed not far away. Owen Knight, who had broken both legs, ran away. Knight Murray also ran towards the surviving brown-haired twins who were closer, and shouted to Renly without looking back, "Protect the girl first." In fact, he didn't need to say it. Renly had already dragged the panicked girl to the corner of the arena. Unfortunately, after a few steps, the dragon suddenly swooped down on him. A loud and angry roar accompanied by a dark red dragon flame suddenly gushed out. At the critical moment, Renly suddenly hugged Rhea and fell to the ground. The heat wave came from the sky, and a few strands of hair seemed to be scorched, and even the smell of burning emerged, but fortunately the angle was not burned by the dragon flame. The two people lying on the ground barely avoided the swooping fire, but some people behind them were not so lucky. Knight Murray, who was running, reacted quickly and jumped to the side, barely avoiding the dragon flame, but the brown-haired figure not far away and Captain Nancy, who had not yet run to where Knight Owen was, only had time to roar before they were completely engulfed by the flames. The heat wave surged, watching the horrible sea of fire falling from the sky in the distance and the hazy struggling figures in it. The broken-legged Knight Owen's eyes were bloodshot, then he looked at the two surviving companions behind the dragon flame, gritted his teeth, picked up the long sword beside him and threw it hard at the dark yellow dragon that was leaning over, roaring and shouting, "Monster, come to me!" Unfortunately, his sword did not hit the target, and the dragon ignored him, but turned in the sky and rushed back to the way it came. "Go to hell, you monster!" At this time, Renly had just climbed up, and a familiar voice suddenly appeared from the side and back. He couldn't help but look back. Knight Murray was struggling to pull a spear picked up from the ground in his hand and threw it at the dragon swooping in the sky. Unlike Knight Owen, his spear hit the belly of the dragon flying at low altitude, but did not cause any damage. "Take the girl away from here!" After shouting desperately at Renly, Knight Murray, holding a shield, stepped back and turned to run. Unfortunately, the giant dragon in the sky just sneezed, and a dark red flame directly wrapped around the fleeing figure, and even the desperate and angry roar became hoarse and dull. The tall figure wrapped in flames struggled and collapsed at the edge of the audience, and the twitching gradually weakened. Then the dragon turned again in the sky, a pair of dark red eyes glowed with cold and violent colors in the sun, and the huge body swooped towards Renly. Chapter 117. The dark yellow-scaled dragon rushed over at high speed, still without making any roar, but the wind wrapped by its wings was quite violent. For some reason, it seemed to be only interested in the 7 knights in the trial field, or in other words, it was only interested in the 3 people who participated in killing Maegor, so that no matter the large number of people fleeing in panic around it, or the Knight Owen who was shouting in grief and anger over there, they did not attract its attention. In the chaotic scene, Renly, who noticed this, looked at the girl who was dragging him with concern, then broke free from the other's palm and ran quickly in another direction. Unfortunately, his speed could not match the pursuit of the dragon. After a while, a gust of wind came from behind him. Renly, who felt that his death was imminent, sighed, and then stood on the edge of the grass without resistance. However, after several seconds, there was no burning sensation behind him. Instead, there was a roar of heavy objects falling to the ground. He could not help but turn his head to look. A petite and thin figure was blocking him with his arms wide open. The earthy yellow dragon covered with spikes had already landed on the ground. It tilted its head and stared at the thin figure in white with its deep dark red eyes. Its violent emotions seemed to have eased, and it did not attack again. This situation made Renly stunned, and then he thought of something unconsciously, but he did not have time to think about it, because when he turned around, he clearly saw that the dragon immediately looked at him over Rhea, and at the same time, the violence in its eyes that had originally calmed down grew again, bloodshot appeared, and fire began to flash in the slightly opened dragon's mouth. Obviously, Rhea could no longer stop it. Discovering this, Renly gritted his teeth and ran in another direction, and the dragon turned its neck to face the direction he was running, with its mouth wide open. Seeing the dragon's neck change position, the thin figure in white hurriedly ran a few steps with her arms outstretched, and stood in front of Renly again. She didn't show any expression, but her back looked extremely stubborn. However, Renly couldn't let the girl stand in front of him. Seeing that the dragon had opened its bright mouth and was ready to spit out dragon flames, he suddenly threw her to the ground. Renly wanted to imitate the action of dodging dragon flames before, but unfortunately this time the dragon stood on the ground. Due to the angle, the dark red surging sea of fire did not spray vertically, but it also poured on the broad back of the blonde figure like violent boiling water. The silver mail made of countless rings quickly became hot and red. The muffled screams that could not be suppressed made the thin body blocked below struggle desperately, and waves of anxious screams were born here. The scream was extremely harsh. The dragon that was spewing dragon flames seemed to be stimulated by something. It suddenly restrained its breath, hissed, turned around and ran away, as if it had sensed the breath of some flood beast. However, there was nothing unusual at the place, except for a tall body whose mail armor on the back melted and mixed with flesh and blood, and whose wounds were slightly glowing with white light. The white light seemed to bloom from the flesh and blood, as if it had a healing effect, but this effect seemed very weak and kept flickering, and the horrible injury did not seem to improve much. The thin girl who was pressed under him had her robe burned away at her calves, revealing a pair of slender but intact legs, which obviously proved that the protection made of her body was not strong. However, the tall figure whose thoughts became extremely blurred due to the pain had no spare energy to think about this problem. His internal organs seemed to be burned, and the whole person was on the verge of breaking. A patch of hair on the back of his head was burned away by sparks, but most of the front looked intact. The girl who was pressed under him was so anxious that she stared at the face that was drooping and facing the ground in the narrow space formed by the human body. She pulled out the arm that was supporting her chest with great effort, and carefully waved her hand in front of the other's gorgeous eyes, while mumbling something in her mouth. "What are you talking about?" The confused murmur was weak and could not be heard by the other party at all, but the trembling lips made Lia happy when she saw it, thinking that he was fine. But then her expression suddenly froze, because after that sentence, the ice blue color in the other's eyes quietly faded and slowly turned into a dead green. The girl was stunned. The situation outside did not stop because of this. Without her scream, the dragon that was scared away before turned back from the sky again, which made some warrior sons who were careful to approach the edge of the arena hurriedly avoid it, and a crying voice came from the empty audience seats. "Did you do it? Make it stop. Please." The bald boy ego was pulling the old nun sitting next to him and begging. The other party shook her head and responded, "It can't be stopped, child, unless revenge is completed, no one can stop." As she said, the dragon had already landed on the grass and crawled towards the target. Sister Ada looked at the charred body blocking the girl from a distance, and then looked at the intact girl below it, and sighed with a melancholy expression. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to put the blame on Visanaya. If you want to blame someone, blame him for getting involved in this trial. He has only been a knight for a short time, why did he have to be so stubborn? What a foolish man." The nun stopped talking before she finished, because she suddenly found that the charred figure suddenly turned into dust and collapsed into nothingness, which made her pupils shrink suddenly. Many details that she had noticed but had not paid attention to quickly emerged in her mind filled with hatred. Her face was uncertain, and her eyes could not help but look at the boy beside her. But before she could ask anything, she suddenly felt a special breath coming from the venue. Looking carefully, the girl covered in dust was still lying on the grass blankly, looking at the sky blankly. Her calves were exposed, and her upper body robe was wrinkled and burnt, but her whole body seemed to become very hazy. This haziness made her look a little unreal, as if she had become a reflection in the water, and the surrounding space turned into a lake. As the reflection swayed vaguely, waves of invisible ripples spread out from it with it as the origin, so that the ground covered with green grass shook faintly, and the light from the sun in the sky was constantly expelled, or constantly absorbed. Invisible ripples spread in all directions. The giant dragon on the green grass not far away noticed this, so it turned around and ran away in a hurry, but it was not faster than the ripples. It even screamed and suddenly turned into a pig-headed dragon with leaf wings and fell from the sky. The Owen Knight, whose face was dull and dead in the arena, was affected by the ripples and his golden hair quickly turned white. A group of warrior sons in the corner were full of horror, but they suddenly shrank inward and finally turned into a group of palm-sized pocket knights looking at each other, and some of them even turned into women. The empty auditorium made a series of creaking sounds after being swept by the ripples. The wooden railings in a certain area began to turn black and shatter, but the surface of the railings in another area instead gave birth to tender green branches and grew rapidly. A hole suddenly appeared somewhere in the trembling ground, and the green grass began to collapse and shrink inward, as if a large amount of soil was swallowed up by the endless black hole. Sister Ada in the audience didn't know what was going on, but she pulled the boy up without hesitation and ran away. However, she had just taken a few steps when a whisper-like chuckle suddenly sounded from behind. The laughter was familiar and strange. Chapter 118. The surging impact was accompanied by a sharp pain like hell coming from the back that spread throughout the body. The feeling made people want to faint, but under the influence of another special invisible force, his mind was able to remain clear, or in other words, he was able to not lose himself in the instinct of the body and still carry out his purpose. This situation can be called torture. Every second passed very long, and it was simply worse than death. Until the impact from the back ended, the influence of the inexplicable force quietly faded away. The severe pain from the back made the tortured will instantly blurred, and finally fell into darkness completely. In a trance, Renly seemed to have returned to his original body. There was no more desperate heat around him, but softness wrapped in smooth substances. The smell in his nose was not the smell of burnt meat and the smell of grass, but a faint fruit fragrance, apples, strawberries, blood oranges from Dorne. The pleasant smell was accompanied by faint conversations and footsteps. The comfortable environment wrapped him up. The severe pain in his back was left with only a lingering illusion in his heart, and the vitality of his whole body gradually returned to normal. But Renly was still immersed in the dimness of his mind, drifting in a daze. The lingering pain made his mind still sluggish and he ignored the outside world. Maybe it was a long time, or maybe it was just a moment. The emergence of two pieces of information made his tightly closed eyes suddenly open, and his mind recovered. His cold ice blue eyes stared at the velvet curtain above the bed, his expression full of disbelief. Successfully guided the son of chaos to the right path, you obtained a chaos mark. You completed all events, you obtained the characteristic, psychic heart. Completed. He murmured, his face was not full of joy, but full of daze. How could it be completed? She has not changed her habit of stealing things, and she still likes to play with fire, and she hasn't learned many words. How could it be completed? This question made him doubtful. After careful recollection, the last impression in his mind was the back of the other party bravely blocking in front of him. Renly reluctantly thought that it might be that his death stimulated her, and then she changed her mind and remembered his previous teachings completely. But for some reason, he always felt uneasy in his heart. There was a special burning sensation on the wrist of his left hand. He raised it to his eyes and looked at it. On the skin where it connected with the palm, the two black and white arcs that seemed to be composed of simple lines crossed in reverse looked like he felt dizzy. Renly frowned unconsciously. The thing in front of him should be the chaotic mark. It looks like a tattoo. He looked at it carefully, but he didn't see any explanation or any abnormality. Apart from the special dizziness, this thing seemed useless. His confusion was mixed with strong regret, anger, and uneasiness, and he was also nostalgic for that world. So after observing it blankly for a while, he suddenly took out a dagger from under the soft pillow and held it tightly regardless of his hungry stomach. Unfortunately, after squeezing it for a long time, the dagger, and he didn't have any reaction, proving that the thing with most of the fragrance dissipated could not support him to enter that special world. After a long while, Renly put the dagger back to its original place, then stepped on the soft light green mirror carpet, walked to the balcony of the exquisite room and sat on the table and chairs. The sky outside was just getting bright at this time, and beyond the balcony, beyond the battlements of the castle, there was a coastline with some ships moored. Looking out, a bright sun at the end of the ocean slowly emits dazzling light, covering the dark blue and grey sea level with brilliant light. The closed windows isolate all noises from the outside world, but the sensitive ears can still hear the faint sound of the tide and various trivial noises in the castle. Looking at the outside world motionlessly, Renly did not consider other ideas for a while, just wanted to let his mind empty and immerse himself in the afterglow of another world. But after a while, there was a sudden knock on the door behind him. "Lord Renly, His Majesty Robert invites you to breakfast." The maid repeats this kind of words every morning, but it sounds quite strange now. "I don't want to eat breakfast," Renly responded, his voice full of fatigue. "Please tell my brother that I ate a few fruits in the morning and I'm full." The maid's voice was worried after hearing this. "My lord, are you sick again? What does it mean to be sick again?" Renly frowned upon hearing this, but he also perked up a little. After taking a deep breath, he raised his voice and said, "I just don't want to get up. I haven't woken up yet, but you said I was full. Do you understand what I mean?" "Okay, sir, I understand." The maid understood, and then left with a tapping sound. However, before Renly could rest, another voice suddenly came soon after. "Lord Renly, I brought the clothes you need to wear for tomorrow's wedding. Please open the door. I need you to try them on yourself." The word wedding made Renly startled, and then he suddenly realized that only 1 night and half a day had passed, and tomorrow was the wedding day of his cheap brother. This made him feel absurd and impatient inexplicably, but he was also disturbed by this kind of alternation and no longer had that kind of melancholy mentality. After sighing, the black-haired boy slid down the chair, walked to the door and opened it. What came into view was a well-dressed, tall and thin old man with a mustache, a black-haired maid, and 2 guards guarding the door. The old man is the royal tailor, and the maid is responsible for dressing Renly. After entering the house, they were busy in front of the dressing mirror, and finally nodded with satisfaction. The boy in the mirror has short, shiny black hair, a fair and delicate face, and stunning eye color that sets off his neat dark green velvet clothes with gold edges. He looks like a little prince who walked out of a story. But the overall temperament seems melancholy and dull. "This suit of clothing fits you very well, my lord, but the yellow color of the cuff lining does not match your appearance, so please take it off first. I need to readjust it." The old tailor's attitude seemed very strict. Renly nodded absently after hearing this. Nodded. His main thought was not on what he was wearing, but on the misty words that appeared in the mirror in front of him. Racial level, LV2. Occupation, Bard, Entry, Knight, Entry. Professional characteristics, sensitivity to music, spirit in singing. Possess knowledge, heraldry LV7, swimming LV7, archery LV5. Possess knowledge, poison making LV5, dagger mastery LV5, fishing LV2. Derivative characteristics, psychic crest, Valyrian blood, mutation, curse of ember, warrior's son, psychic heart. The results of several months of training are hidden behind the knight profession. As long as Renly looks at it intently, these foggy words will transform into another line. Riding skill LV6, lance mastery LV4, sword skill LV4, shield mastery LV4, lance mastery LV2. The bard profession is also the same, except that the professional level. He then stared at the 3 newly added characteristics in the attribute column. The spirit that is being sung. Whenever you make an action that is consistent with the spirit of chivalry in front of others, your combatability and physical fitness will be blessed by the power of belief. Son of the warrior, during the battle, you will receive the blessing of the warrior, one of the 7 aspects of God, and will not be affected by pain. At the same time, your prayers and appeals will be more likely to receive his feedback. Psychic heart, when there are living beings who have a strong desire to communicate with you, you can vaguely hear their voices. Chapter 119. The atmosphere in the small bedroom in Magur's building was extremely quiet. The 2 boys on the balcony were lying in front of the window and looking down. They didn't speak for a long time, and the expressions on their faces seemed to be frightened. Generally, they finally looked at each other. "Why are the chicken legs you brought moving?" the black-haired boy asked the other party first. These words made the already shocked blonde boy even more confused. He replied blankly, "I don't know, it is ripe, but why is it moving? Is this castle really haunted?" Renly said thoughtfully. Tyrion couldn't help but feel tense when he heard this. He couldn't wait to look out the window, and at the same time stuttered, "Do you want to call the guards? It's best this way." Renly nodded, his face serious, "But I don't think they will believe what we saw." Tyrion nodded in agreement, his face pale. Then he became a little restless as he sat back down, his eyes always glancing at the remaining half of the roasted capon in front of Renly. His expression seemed to be full of fear, but there was also curiosity brewing in his eyes. Under this situation, Renly had no intention of eating more, so he moved the stool under him a few steps back, pointed at the food on the table and said, "This chicken is weird, I think we need to send it to the pie. Maester Seal, maybe he can figure out why its legs move. I'll just take him out." The blonde boy suddenly said, "Then I'll ask our bachelor. Grand Bachelor Pycelle is currently busy with the wedding, so he won't be free." "That's fine, but you have to be careful, maybe the remaining half of the chicken will come back to life," Renly kindly reminded. Tyrion gritted his teeth and nodded, then stood up, picked up the plate with some trembling and prepared to say goodbye, but Renly suddenly thought of something at this moment, so when he saw him off to the door, he said, "I hope the warrior will give you courage, Tyrion." "Leon." The expression on the other party's face became more serious when he heard this, but his slightly trembling hands suddenly stabilized. After nodding hard to Renly, he walked quickly down the corridor. Renly watched the other person's back disappear thoughtfully, then shook his head and closed the door. Then he looked at his left wrist. The cooked chicken legs just ran away. This seemed to the little devil to be a point worth studying, but Renly couldn't help but suspect that it was because of himself. Because he was grabbing the chicken leg with his left hand, and on this left hand, there was a tattoo called the Mark of Chaos. Confusion. Frowning and observing the mark on his wrist, Renly was not sure for a moment what the situation with this thing was. He raised his hand and touched the door and wall, but nothing special happened. He was unconsciously in a trance. The girl's intimate smile was still vivid in his mind, and Renly could no longer hold back some of the questions he didn't dare to think about before. What exactly are Sons of Anarchy? This question seems to be a fog. At first Renly thought that this title meant that Rhea was related to him, and that he was Chaos. Although there are many puzzling points in this suspicion, it is barely justified. After all, according to the original history, his series of actions after entering the dungeon did lead the history to another trajectory, which can be called chaos. Moreover, the girl involved seems to be able to get along with him regardless of her appearance or background. But now looking at his wrist, Renly suddenly no longer thought about it that way. What exactly are Sons of Anarchy? Is he really his child? Or some other creature formed from forces he couldn't understand? What does Son of Anarchy mean? Is it Son of Chaos, or Son of Chaos? What does the so-called chaos represent? The extended question is, what exactly is a historical copy? Is it another parallel world? Or is it a past of the world we live in? Being a simple Dan was enough to make Renly feel strange. Although he had comforted himself with the fact that this was a fantasy world, the appearance of this mark, a mark that did not exist in the system information, made him suddenly confused. The contrast between this so-called reward and the tone of many rewards given in the past, the eggshells eaten by insects, the similarity in appearance to the Dornish people, the talent of being able to learn words despite knowing nothing but inexplicably, all kinds of inconspicuous but crucial important clues emerged at once. Obviously Rhea couldn't just be a freak born from an egg, the girl who had a lot to do with dragons, nor could she just be his daughter. So what is she? What is the so-called right path? What is happening to her now? He stood there and thought for a long time with a gloomy expression. He finally sighed and felt that his thoughts were in a mess. So he tried not to think about these things, but his eyes couldn't help but glance at the books in the corner of the balcony. After being stunned for a moment, the black-haired boy walked over, tied it up and put it back on the table. Then he sat on a chair on the balcony and looked at the castle and sea outside the balcony. It felt familiar yet unfamiliar. Renly was in a bad mood, but not because of those problems. After experiencing time travel reincarnation and traveling through dungeons, he was actually used to not being able to understand many problems, and he didn't have the idea of resolutely trying to figure it out. After all, he knew too little, and he could never figure it out when he was trying to figure it out. He just regretted that he left too quickly and didn't have time to say goodbye. I saw Tyrion again the next morning after the chicken leg moving incident, which was the wedding day of Robert and Cersei. Because he entered the dungeon during the gap before his brother's wedding, Renly had no time to rest and relax as soon as he came out, nor did he have much time to study his new abilities. Instead, he had to devote himself to various busy events. At this time, King's Landing was extremely noisy. The common people were talking about the wedding that was about to begin today, and the noble lords were busy wearing various decent dresses and dressing up with servants, and preparing their own gifts. The venue for His Majesty Robert's wedding was in the Cathedral of St. Baylor on the top of Vicenia Hill in the city, but on the eve of the wedding, a breakfast banquet was held in the Red Castle. The participants in the banquet were mainly the family members of the newlyweds and their respective lords and knights. At this juncture, they presented gifts to the king, including exquisite jewelry, gorgeous belts, gold spurs cast in pure gold, and various practical or impractical daggers. The new king was crowned not long ago, but his hobbies have long been widely known. Apart from drinking and fighting, Robert Baratheon especially likes to collect daggers, so there are a lot of these things in the gifts. Although Renly is small, he also wants to send a gift. He originally thought of finding something random in his trash can and sending it up. After all, no one would care what he gave. However, the court steward thought about it for him first, so the gift Renly sent became a pure gold cloak buckle, which was not very expensive, but not cheap either. However, sending gifts was not the only thing Renly had to do today. The middle-aged court steward with a big nose kept nagging in his ear, constantly reminding the boy of his tasks in the upcoming wedding. In fact, it was nothing, just holding the cloak for the cheap brother and scattering flowers for the newlyweds. Even though it was so simple, the royal butler still seemed uneasy, which made Renly feel impatient. So when he saw Tyrion mixed in with a group of blonde Lannisters, he suddenly walked towards him, ignoring the nagging butler behind him who treated him like a 3-year-old child. "Good morning, Tyrion." He greeted the other party after approaching, and the ugly boy in decent clothes also returned the greeting in a formal manner. Then, after negotiating with a blonde man holding his hand, he and Renly ran to the corner of the breakfast banquet. For some reason, this little devil of the Lannister family seemed a little wilted. Renly asked curiously, so he glanced at Lord Tywin who was talking to His Majesty the King not far away, and whispered, "Father took the chicken to feed the dog." His tone was gloomy. "Why?" "Because he said that the chicken looked like a beggar seeing a gold dragon." "Didn't you send the chicken to your maester?" Renly asked strangely. "I wanted to send it, but then I wanted to see if it would come back to life, so I didn't," Tyrion said, as if he was afraid that Renly would blame him for not keeping his word, so he changed the subject and said, "Then my father found out, and then, I argued with him a few times. It seems that the last chicken leg incident brought them closer together." The little guy in front of him looked a little more cheerful, but also quite depressed. He glanced at the bald middle-aged Duke father again, and it was obvious that he was still frightened by some of the situations he faced before. Seeing him so cowardly, Renly found it hard to believe that he would talk back to his elders. This reminded him of what he had said to him yesterday when they parted ways, so he couldn't help but ask, "Why did you talk back? Was what he said too much?" "Not too much." The other party hesitated and said, "Father just wanted me to throw away the chicken. I didn't want to, so he ordered me to do it, and then I didn't want to talk back, but I couldn't help it." Chapter 120. The crowd that came for the wedding was like an ocean in the night, filling the magnificent church hall. Compared with it, the breakfast meeting in the morning was just an appetizer. At this time, Renly was standing under the statue of the god in the center of the hall, holding a heavy golden cloak in his hand, performing the exclusive task of being the king's younger brother. In front of him were the two parties to the marriage, the black-haired king wearing a golden and black silk coat and a velvet cloak, and the slender golden curly-haired girl wearing a crimson silk dress. They were standing in front of the statue of the Father and the Mother of God deep in the church, receiving the blessing of the Archbishop of the church. The fat Archbishop wore a huge crown made of gold foil and crystal. The sun was shining in from the high window behind him. The crystal crown continued to emit colorful rainbow light as the Archbishop's big head swayed slightly. The words from his mouth echoed in the sea of people without even a cough, and they seemed particularly sacred. Renly focused on his thick, intestine-like lips opening and closing. He seemed very serious, but in fact his thoughts had already diverged. A discovery at the breakfast meeting suddenly aroused his interest in the church, or the gods behind the church. The results of a single experiment were not very convincing, but the system had already explained it. Since the characteristics of the son of a warrior can allow him to get a response from the warrior, does it mean that the gods of this world must exist? If they exist, in what form do they exist? And what is the relationship with the historical copies he traveled through? The characteristics obtained in the historical copies can now be responded to in reality. Does this prove that history and reality are actually the same world? Or are the so-called gods just some existences like program machines? As long as Renly has a special power, the wishes he speaks out can be responded to. This characteristic itself does not seem to have much effect, and it seems to have a duration, but the meaning behind it makes Renly have to ponder it. However, the schedule was tight, and Renly was faced with many busy things as soon as he came out. Renly did not have time to experiment carefully for the time being. To what extent can it do? Can it satisfy all wishes? Or is it limited to warriors? How long does it last? As long as you say it, it will respond? The ceremony is very cumbersome. Because the church's god is seven-faceted, the number 7 is very important in Westeros, and has long been infiltrated into customs, laws, daily life, etc. So the newlyweds in front of them not only have to make 7 vows, but also accept 7 layers of blessings and exchange 7 promises. After a series of procedures, Renly thought a lot of questions, and his arms dragging the cloak were a little sore, but when the choir sang the wedding hymn around him, he immediately cheered up. Do the people watching the ceremony have doubts about the legitimacy of the marriage of the newlyweds in front of you? The majestic voice of the archbishop spread throughout the church and echoed. This kind of questioning is an inherent procedure of the wedding ceremony. Under normal circumstances, no one will stand up to make trouble, and there is no accident at the moment. Then the cloak exchange ceremony, which represented the marriage into the husband's family, officially began. The majestic Duke Tywin Lannister stepped forward to take off the cloak that his daughter was originally wearing. As the younger brother, Renly walked closer with neat steps and presented the heavy golden cloak in his hands to his cheap elder brother. The other party took the cloak and shook it off, wrapped it around the bride and tied it on her personally. Then when the bride and Robert kissed deeply, the High Bishop spoke on the side and declared. Here, in the presence of the gods and the world. He said loudly, I solemnly declare that Robert of the Baratheon family and Cersei of the Lannister family are married. From now on, they are one body, one mind, and one soul, forever. Anyone who interferes with their marriage will be ruthlessly cursed. After speaking, many nobles who watched the ceremony applauded, and the wedding ceremony officially ended. However, the end of the ceremony does not mean that the wedding is complete. There are still a series of procedures to go through, such as the newlyweds standing outside under the statue of Saint Baelor to receive the blessings of the people and nobles, and holding a wedding dinner in the evening, and finally making trouble in the bridal chamber. Renly acted as a companion and a flower-scattering boy during this process. He felt that this task was somewhat boring, and he was also worried that the flowers in his hand would suddenly come alive, or something else. Fortunately, until the end of this task, he got on the carriage and returned to the Red Castle, and nothing happened. Your task is basically completed. Some noble ladies will invite you to dance at the banquet in the evening. Before that, go back and practice to avoid making a fool of yourself. A faint voice echoed in the carriage, and Stannis, dressed in a golden and black costume, was telling his absent-minded brother. Are you sure? Renly glanced at his cheap second brother who spoke harshly. I am so small, and I want to dance with others. He also wanted to say that others would have to bend over and jump around. But the other party obviously had no intention of answering this question, and instead continued to speak. No matter what other time it is, you must attend breakfast tomorrow. Don't make excuses like you did yesterday. This is polite, otherwise the new queen will have a problem with you. It was normal to hear this from someone else, but it was a bit strange for Renly to hear it from this person, because in his impression, this cheap second brother has never had much emotional intelligence. After the wedding, Mace Tyrell will be leaving King's Landing, and you will go to the Reach with him. Looking at the boy with a blank face, Stannis said, I am against sending you to be an adopted son, but Robert insists on doing so. He is the king now, and I can't quarrel with him. Renly nodded, thinking that there should be more to follow this sentence, such as some instructions, so he pretended to listen attentively. But after the other party said this, he stopped talking, but sat there quietly looking at the boy, looking outside the carriage from time to time, and occasionally with a thoughtful expression, and it was unclear what he was thinking. Renly was speechless about this, but he was used to this weirdo, so he didn't care and turned to concentrate on his own affairs. About the present, about the past, and more about the future. The banquet will not start until tonight, and there is nothing he needs to do during this time. After the carriage returned to the Red Keep, Renly was sent back to Maegor's Holdfast. But before he walked into his little room, he suddenly saw someone who shouldn't be here. The weird swamplander whose dagger he stolen.